Chapter 346. Any computer would crash. The users would most likely use this time to make a cup of coffee or tea, rest for a while with their legs crossed, and wait for the Choose System's indifferent welcome to ring out. No one would treat this as something that would shock the world and make the gods weep. However, the central computer deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation would not crash. It had not been rebooted for countless years. Therefore, on that day in early autumn, when an enormous 2D light screen suddenly turned black and all the sub-processing workstations fell into a dead silence, the entire Bureau of Proclamation was dumbfounded. The word dumbfounded was not enough to describe the scene and emotions at that time. From the director to the most basic data analysts, everyone stared at the darkness and listened to the silence. They felt like the star that always shone on the Capitol ring had suddenly gone out, and the billions of stars in the universe had suddenly disappeared without a trace. The Federal Central Computer had stopped working. No one knew what this meant for the Federation and human society better than the employees of the Bureau of Proclamation. They knew that once the Central Computer was lost, the people of the Imperium could easily launch a large-scale attack. There was no need for the invaders of the Imperium to attack at all. The vast territory of the Federation would be torn apart because of the loss of its most powerful central force. The entire human society would fall apart. What would become of human beings when they lost the glory of the Constitution? No one dared to think about this terrifying question. In the face of the sudden darkness and silence, more than 1,000 employees of the Bureau of Proclamation above and below ground were silent. Some of them put their hands together, and some of the female employees even shed tears of fear and helplessness. This kind of extremely shocking accident made everyone's heart almost unable to bear it. They did not know if the Federal Central Computer, the existence that they affectionately called Old Thing, had truly reached the end of its life, or if it was just taking a nap and would wake up soon. This was not like losing one's parents. This was more sorrowful than losing one's family. This was not the shock of spring thunder. This was more powerful than thunder and lightning. Thankfully, the central computer deep below the ground did not pause for long. After 13,221 seconds, a tiny bright spot appeared at the center of the wide, dark light beam. Then this bright spot suddenly exploded, radiating countless blazing white lines. In just an instant, it illuminated the vast underground space, as if countless nebulas were spreading, condensing, and disappearing. However, this time period was too short, and it was impossible to distinguish with the naked eye. Even the fastest video control system could not detect it. After the light, it was quiet and normal. Countless images from every corner of the Federation appeared on the light beam again. Countless messages flashed quickly in order in a complicated and incomprehensible machine language. However, the lines seemed to be flashing faster than usual. A mechanical voice sounded. Upgrade complete. Other than that, everything was normal. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if those 7 seconds had never happened. When the Federal Central Computer fell into darkness, the people of the Bureau of Proclamation thought that the whole world had collapsed. When it returned to normal, they suddenly felt that this beautiful world had been reborn. In the ancient myths before the catastrophe, it seemed that a certain creator took 7 days to create this bizarre world. However, the God in the hearts of the people of the Bureau of Proclamation only took 7 seconds to rebuild the world in their hearts. 7 seconds was too short. The shock, fear, and despair on the faces of many of the employees had just started to ripple. Many of the female employees' tears had just flowed a centimeter before the process was over. Their emotions instantly fell into an indescribable state of emptiness. The Federal Central Computer underground of the Bureau of Proclamation, according to the rules of the Constitution, would self-upgrade. However, the people of the Federation who were still alive today had never witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Furthermore, according to the records left behind in the manual, the Federal Central Computer's upgrade required an extremely long period of time. The hardware and related supporting software would gradually self-upgrade. No one had ever thought that this old thing would suddenly take a nap and frighten countless people. Then, when it opened its eyes again, it coldly announced that the upgrade was successful. What kind of upgrade was this? No one knew. The unexpected crash or self-upgrade of the Federal Central Computer this time was manually listed as a second-order incident. It was strictly confidential. Other than the core employees of the Bureau of Proclamation, only President Pabre and Vice President Byron knew about it. Even those on Parliament Hill had no idea what kind of soul-stirring 7 seconds the Bureau of Proclamation had experienced. It took a long time for the Bureau of Proclamation to shake off the shock and complicated emotions. However, there was still a certain question in everyone's heart, a certain shadow of unknown color that kept floating and floating. The old director and Shui Judong's eyes met briefly before naturally looking away. It was as if they did not want to further recall and analyze those 7 seconds. As the two senior officials who had worked the longest in the Bureau of Proclamation, had the highest authority, and understood the central computer the most, they had already developed a certain understanding in their life of monotonous work. The level of civilization represented by the underground central computer had always been higher than the average level of civilization in the Federation society. Just the fact that the central computer could self-upgrade was the crystallization of wisdom left behind by the great group of 5 for human society, was something that the current scientific system could not achieve. Before the catastrophe, human civilization had developed to an astonishing level. Although for tens of thousands of years, human beings have been constantly improving and catching up, and had probably even surpassed their predecessors in certain aspects. In the end, they still could not recover their past glory in certain core aspects. Old Director Tai reached out and listed all the files on Sulu on the light screen as top secret. He sat in the chair silently for a long time. When he thought of the Human Resource Planning Commission under the Bureau of Proclamation and those factories, he could not help but feel a certain kind of emotion. After so many years, the Bureau of Proclamation was still just that old thing service staff. They knew what they should know, but they could never understand what they did not have the ability to understand. Living with the crystallization of a huge mechanical civilization that was as vast as the stars and witnessing its extraordinary abilities, in a weird organization like the Constitutional Bureau, many of the staff would be imperceptibly influenced. They were not followers of the Church of Science, but somewhere in the deepest part of their hearts, they went against the scientific spirit they should have and were extremely superstitious. They believed and worshipped the central computer obsessively. They saw the cold machine as the spirit of the Federation, as the last remnant of the great civilization of the previous generation. As the service staff who looked after this remnant, they also felt infinite glory and pride for it. This kind of superstition came from the worship of the level of wisdom that humans could reach themselves, from the dazzling deeds of the glory of the Charter over countless years, and from the principle that machines would never make mistakes. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation were superstitious about it, worshipped it, and believed in it as family. That was why they called it the old thing. The old director was no exception. He silently looked at the rapidly flashing mechanical words on the light screen. Suddenly, he lost all interest in investigating Su Li's identity. Since the old thing was still unwilling to determine the identity of this person, there had to be its own precise and irreversible logical reasons. There was an unwritten rule within the Bureau of Proclamation. This rule did not seem to conform to the spirit of the Charter, but it had been deeply ingrained in the hearts of every staff of this independent organization for countless years. They could not and did not want to resist. This rule was, 1. The old thing would never make a mistake. 2. If the old thing made a mistake, please refer to the first rule. From the first day I entered the Bureau, I've been thinking about a question. The old director gave up thinking and picked up the golf club from behind the chair again. He sighed and said, I don't know if the old thing is alive or not. When Shui Judong heard this, he felt a chill run down his back. It was so cold that it was painful. In fact, this was probably the question that every staff who had worked in the Bureau of Proclamation for a long time would have, because the central computer deep underground was too omnipotent, even though it had never shown any human emotions. When I was at the 7th Research Institute, I studied this in my doctoral thesis. After a moment of silence, Chui Zedong said, according to the core logic program of the old thing and the charter designed by the 5-person team, if it really produces a thought pattern similar to carbon-based life, it will directly self-destruct. As if he felt that this was not enough to calm his wavering heart, Chui Zedong quickly added, and from a philosophical point of view, this does not make sense. That's true. The old director coughed twice and opened his somewhat listless eyes. He walked out of the office with the golf club and said, and what does this have to do with us? It will live for millions or even hundreds of millions of years, but we will all die in the end. I have never doubted that even if the entire Federation is destroyed, the old thing will still exist until the end of the universe. If that's the case, we don't have the right to talk about it. Probably only the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation, who had worked for the Federal Central Computer for their entire lives, could talk about this kind of thing so casually. This was because their lives and even breathing were connected to the cold computing machine underground. They had a natural sense of intimacy. However, if this conversation in the Bureau of Proclamation was leaked, it would cause a lot of trouble. In fact, Director Jean and Chui Zedong's assistant were only talking about it in general. They didn't have the ability to investigate the 7-second problem, and they didn't know that the Federation's central computer had suddenly crashed. It was only because when it was investigating Su Li's true identity, it encountered a logic problem that made it feel difficult. At the same time, it came into contact with a trace of something that made its mechanical program somewhat uncomfortable. After the 7-second crash, the Federal Central Computer was rebooted. No one noticed that at the end of the last sentence, there was a symbol that represented a smiley face. Sorry, I overestimated myself. It's hard to bear, and writing is not going well. That's all for today. I need to rest and recover first. I really hope that everyone will give me a few monthly votes. This has nothing to do with the update. The monthly votes have been exceeded, but I still don't have the energy. This is related to the body, but it is also related to the mind. Writing a book requires the accumulation of murderous intent, accumulating momentum, and needing everyone's encouragement, allowing me to rest and then rush forward. This is very much in need of everyone's mental support. Chapter 347. The 7 seconds during which the Federal Central Computer crashed, or rather upgraded, were precisely the 7 seconds during which Su Lu was in the mountains behind the base, calling out affectionately but receiving no reply, causing him to break out in cold sweat. As a mechanical intelligence that did not have a physical body but calmly observed the entire human society, the reason why there was a problem when investigating Su Li's true identity and confirming his level was because there was an unavoidable problem in the core of its program. This program problem was Su Lu. Over the countless years, the glory of the charter left behind by the 5-man team had only discovered 71 abnormal situations and 1 suspected abnormal situation. These abnormal situations were all determined by the central computer as first-order events. It should be known that in its long life, there had been no other first-order events other than the invasion of the Empire that it had determined. According to the standard procedures for dealing with abnormal situations, the Federal Central Computer would send out a request to contact the abnormal situation. If the other party refused, it would submit a report to the government for handling or use its own core authority to directly and silently erase the abnormal situation. Initiating contact required a certain level of intrusion into the human brain. This method completely violated the first charter and was extremely dangerous. Anyone who accepted the initiating contact would have to allow a machine to probe and even influence their brain and even obtain the opportunity to control their own life and death through the chip at the back of their neck. The owner of the 71 abnormal situations, that astonishingly talented uncle who wandered the stars, coldly rejected the call from the glory of the charter. Thus, he became the Federation's most wanted criminal, causing countless explosions and manhunts. In that dark dream, almost subconsciously, Su Lu accepted the initiating contact request from the charter computer. From that moment on, Su became the first living being in history to be able to communicate with the central computer in a two-way manner. Today, the central computer had an almost absolute probability of inferring that citizen number SLAT 510200431X Su, a citizen of the Federation, was the suspected abnormal situation that it had stored in the core file 3 years ago. The word suspected could even be completely removed. In the dark dream, Su accepted the initiating contact request. The central computer no longer generated reports to the government and calmly observed him for a long time. But now that it had determined that he was the 72nd abnormal situation, according to the hidden highest authority in the core program of the central computer, it should not hesitate to destroy Su's existence, leaving no trace in history. Because such a loophole as an abnormal situation was very likely to threaten the glory of the charter or the collapse of the social structure designed by the five-man team. But miraculously, in Su's body, the energy that was similar to a biological microcurrent violently attacked the disguise chip at the back of his neck, triggering a certain backdoor. Any citizen who entered an abnormal situation would be the first target to be eliminated by the central computer underground of the Bureau of Proclamation. But when the backdoor that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years was activated, the command that the central computer had to execute was observe the status of the person to be contacted and inform the five-man team. The five-man team had been dead for tens of thousands of years. How could they be notified? For the omniscient and omnipotent charter computer, this was still a difficult problem. It had read all the ancient religious classics and bizarre magical literature that existed in this world, but still could not extend a tentacle from its body made of machinery and electrons to the abyss that did not exist to summon the 5 irresponsible sages to deal with this problem. Therefore, the central computer could only observe Su, generate top-secret observation reports, and wait for tens of billions of years later, when a universe died out or rewound, when even entropy began to become chaotic, when time might rewind, and the 5 fellows who had long been in peace would crawl out of the ground again. But before these impossible things happened, the Federal Central Computer at least had to ensure one thing, and that was that the target of its observation must be alive so that it could continue to observe. This was a very simple logical inference. The Federal Central Computer was not a golden finger left to Su by the Creator. It would never violate the Federation's laws and the spirit of the Charter to handle any affairs for the Naked Ape, unless the Naked Ape's request was legal and reasonable. But it could not let Su die. So in the desperate situation of the Foundation building, Su's left eye suddenly could use its power to see ghosts, see light, and see everything. It was just that it had to ensure the biological survival of the observation target. Citizen Su was the first target to be eliminated, and Citizen Su was the first target to be protected. The first charter, which was hundreds of thousands of words, made an extremely precise division at all levels of authority, blocking any logical fallacies. Even if the central computer was faced with 2 completely opposite instructions of the same sequence at the same time, it could still make its own judgment mechanically and calmly within a billionth of a second. But in the face of Su's program problem, the central computer could not make its own judgment. It was still the same old saying. All of this gave people headaches, and the source of the central computer's annoyance to the point of crashing was because the 5-person team that left a backdoor in the chip behind the human neck and instructions in its core program were 5 very irresponsible guys. The Federal Central Computer had existed for a long time and had been upgraded independently for a long time, but its core was still the same simple, even shabby, binary principle from the earliest days. In a certain ancient philosophical debate, this principle was somewhat similar to the existence and absence of contrast at the beginning of the world. For it, Su's program problem was the problem of 0 and 1, the problem of life and death, the problem of Tobe and not Tobe, the problem of right and wrong. These problems seem to be the simplest and most basic, but in fact, the simpler and more basic things were often the most complex and profound. No one knew what happened in the 7 seconds of the military exercise and the 7 seconds of the central computer's pause. What people did not know was that the Federation's central computer, which could simultaneously monitor countless planets, was suffering from a form of schizophrenia in the face of such a small problem. Countless core program data streams were rapidly calculating, colliding, distinguishing, processing, or perhaps thinking in the computing core's deep underground, in the streams of data fragments in space, on the microcircuits of every approved chip, and in every place imaginable to humans. They were rapidly calculating, colliding, distinguishing, processing, or perhaps thinking. The Federal Central Computer was operating almost crazily, directly leading to a crash. 7 seconds of time, for the universe, was just a moment, but for it, which was operating at a high speed, it was like countless centuries had passed. During the temporary pause of this once-in-a-lifetime the glory of the Charter, the tiny 66-byte information fragment that it had extracted from the camouflage chip behind Sue Lee's neck a long time ago suddenly entered its core program. This was the information remnant attached to the camouflage chip. At this time, it finally exploded in the computing core of the central computer. This information remnant that came from Feng Yu's hands, but no one knew where it came from, was like a ray of light that illuminated a certain darkness. Vaguely, one side that had simply divided the universe into two had won. Some of the restraints that were branded in its core program were broken, and some very strange things began to grow. People only knew that the central computer had been upgraded, and that its operation was faster and smoother than before. However, no one noticed that at the end of that line of program, this cold mechanical intelligence had left a rather human-like smiley face. And Su Lu, who had felt the different mischievous emotions of the old thing in the MX mecha back then, should have been the one to directly see the problem. Unfortunately, at that time, he was focused on breaking into the Iron 7th Division's camp, and thus missed the opportunity to remember the most shocking moment of human society. All of this was just the beginning. The road ahead was exceptionally long. The autumn was deep, and the yellow leaves fell. Sulu sat on a bench in the Charter Square, narrowing his eyes as he looked at the statues of the 5-person team in the middle of the square. He stared at the face of the middle-aged woman beside the statues, and couldn't help but feel a strong sense of curiosity. Among the 5-person team that led humanity out of the catastrophe and rebuilt society, why was the one who was regarded as a computer genius a woman, the mother of the glory of the Charter? He laughed out loud and asked the omnipresent central computer through the chip behind his neck, "She's your mother? Then wouldn't I have to call her old grandmother?" He didn't know how the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamations basement had changed because of his program problem. On this autumn square, he was just like before, chatting with the old thing as if he was chatting with his family. Today was a rest day, but strangely, there was basically no one in the Charter Square. Even the usual crowd of tourists had disappeared. A screen in the corner of the square was broadcasting live news. Above the stone steps of the Parliament building, President Pabre of the Federation, Vice President Byron, and the Deputy Chairman of the Management Committee were welcoming the arrival of a person. The man's hair was white, and his skin was dark. He wore a simple and plain military uniform, but it wasn't the official uniform of the Federation. But in front of these big shots of the Federation, the aura this man displayed was in no way inferior. This was because his name was Nan Shui, and he was the highest leader of the anti-government forces. He led his troops in the vast Green Dragon Mountains and fought against the Federation government for many years. President Pabre smiled slightly and took the initiative to walk down the stairs, extending his broad and powerful hand. The leader of Nan Shui was slightly startled, and then a smile appeared on his face, and he gripped the hand firmly. When the two hands firmly grasped each other, a burst of extremely enthusiastic applause came from the screen, and then the thunderous applause and cheers from the Parliament Mountain, not far away, also spread to the quiet Charter Square. The great reconciliation of the Federation has finally set foot on the official agenda, Su Lu thought emotionally as he sat on the bench. There's more at night. These few chapters were originally the most troublesome, and I was the most mentally retarded, but they were also the things that had to be written. It just so happened that I encountered the moment when my spirit collapsed the most. It really was a headache like that of an old thing. After revising it several times, I roughly understood what I wanted to write. This wasn't the crux of the spy's story, but only one of the points. In the future, I won't specifically write about this aspect, but in the final part of the spy's story, I'll definitely write about the remnant information. Chapter 348. The political negotiations between the Federation government and Green Dragon Mountain had mostly come to an end. Both sides had reached a broad consensus, which was why this handshake in front of the Parliament's mountain gate was possible. The political prisoners locked up in the prison were all released, and the exchange of prisoners of war accumulated over the past 7 years had long been completed. Only a portion of the issues related to the George Carlin Youth Army were still in dispute. Over the past few years, the federal government had been accusing the Green Dragon Mountain of inciting the youth through kidnapping and brainwashing. Furthermore, the federal government had targeted the 300 missing persons cases against the Green Dragon Mountain. During the negotiations, the government demanded that the anti-government forces of the Green Dragon Mountain immediately hand over the youths and let them return to their warm homes. However, the Green Dragon Mountain insisted that the youths had entered the mountain voluntarily. They had been inspired by the ideals of the George Carlinism and the anti-government forces, so they had resolutely left their homes. Because it involved many angry parents, the Federation government did not make any clear concessions during the negotiations. However, these small differences could not stop the entire Federation from calling for unity and jointly resisting the Empire's surging momentum. Relevant negotiations continued, and other aspects had long begun to develop in a good direction. Before this historic handshake, the anti-government army had already accepted the government's proposed peace plan. The leader of Nanshui refused the proposal to enter the Federation Management Committee as an honorary chairman, and even coldly refused the position of vice president that Mr. Byron had so generously and farsightedly offered. He chose to return to Green Dragon Mountain and live in seclusion after the negotiations, but agreed that a considerable portion of the anti-government army would be reorganized into the government army. This portion of the anti-government army would be transferred to the 1st Military Region, and in the extremely short future, they would be thrown into the fiery front lines of the West Woods region. The Nanshui leader and the anti-government Central Committee firmly believed that this was the only way to send a sufficiently clear message to the entire Federation. Green Dragon Mountain was willing to reconcile with the government, not because of any political or benefit considerations, but only to resist the Empire's bloody invasion. These weren't just words, but also what they were about to do. Unlike last year's presidential election, Su Lu knew nothing about the political changes in the upper echelons of the Federation. During that time, he had always been locked up in the Black Prison or training officers in the base. The reason he was sitting in Charter Square today was because he was waiting for a piece of good news that he had been waiting for a long time. Through the training exercises in the base, Su Lu proved his value to the upper echelons of the Federation government. The relevant departments finally softened their attitude in the face of his persistent application. Of course, more importantly, because of the current political climate in the Federation, the presidential residence finally issued an amnesty document signed by President Pabre, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Defense. There was a sea of people in front of Parliament Hill, but the Charter Square was somewhat quiet and lonely. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he watched the real-time picture on the light beam. Listening to the thunderous applause and President Pabre's firm words, he was somewhat absent-minded for a moment. A dark green military vehicle drove over from the west side of the street. It was about 20 meters away from the bench where Su Lu was sitting, but it could not go any further. This was because at some point in time, in the corner of Charter Square, there suddenly appeared a few calm and strong men. They blocked in front of Su Lu and stopped the military vehicle. After leaving the base and starting their vacation, Team 7 still left 6 people around Su Lu as a security force. Although Su Lu was the highest director of Team 7, the arrangement of the Ministry of Defense was still a little surprising. At this time, the few men blocking the military vehicle were the armed members of Team 7, led by Xiong Linquan. Major Lan Xiaolong appeared behind Su Li's bench glanced at the hand signal from Xiong Linquan, nodded, and whispered in Su Li's ear, "No problem." Su Li shook his head, got up, and walked to the military vehicle, and said, "The pardon order has been issued. The government can't go back on their words. Besides, even if they won't go back on their words, why bother with me? This is the order of the Ministry of Defense. Your safety is the focus of our work." Lan Xiaolong shrugged, followed behind him, and said, "Besides, this friend of yours is not an ordinary person. Who knows what accidents might happen? It's never wrong to be careful." At this time, the side door of the dark green military vehicle opened, and a man walked out of the vehicle. His cheeks were pale, and his hair was messy in the autumn wind. Only that pair of peach blossom eyes and that beautiful and handsome face did not seem to be worn away by nearly a year in prison. After the handsome and haggard man got out of the vehicle, he looked up at the sky, completely ignoring the lively news on the light screen behind him. He took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and seemed to be extremely intoxicated. Looking at this scene, Su Lu silently quickened his pace and walked toward him, but in his heart, he was thinking about the news from the Shishan compound. It was said that in the negotiations between the government and the anti-government army, there was no such arrangement. It was the legendary anti-government army intelligence leader who personally proposed the conditions to the Government Federation's investigation director. If it was not for this guy would probably continue to be locked up. The last time the two sat in the pool of Senator Macklin's blood, smoking and listening to the sound of the bell, it was almost a year ago. 2 months ago, the Federation government restarted the Macklin Project. This seed of the empire, the shrewd senator, was still not at peace after his death, and gradually, the Federation stripped him of his bright exterior. Macklin died. Macklin stinked. Pabre became the president. Nanshui came to the capital, and the Federation was reconciled. It was said that a few days ago, the former president of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, died quietly. The world always changed so quickly that the people in it did not have time to feel the relationship between the sea and the field before they realized that they were no longer in the same place. The dark green military vehicle drove away silently. The amnesty of the Federation government was always so quiet. No one wanted this kind of political transaction to be exposed to the public. Sula walked up to him and looked him up and down with narrowed eyes. He took out a pack of 37 cigarettes from the pocket of his military uniform and put one between Macklin's dry and thin lips. Carefully blocking the wind with his hand, he lit it seriously. With a hiss, the flame on the end of the cigarette lit up brightly, retreating quickly like the burning twilight on the plains. Shi Qinghai took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and furrowed his brows. He seemed to be in pain, but he seemed to be enjoying it, but he was silent for a long time. After a while, he took the cigarette out from between his lips and handed it to Su Lu. Su Lu took it and also took a deep drag. He choked and coughed a few times. With a slightly hoarse voice, he said, "You've lost a bit of weight, but other than that, you haven't changed much." "Of course." Shi Qinghai looked at Su Lu with a smile and said, "You should know better than anyone what kind of person I am. How did you survive 5 months in the Black Prison?" Su Lu handed the cigarette over and took one for himself. This was the question he was most worried about in the past few months. When he was in the Fox Fortress, the old man chatted with him and played porn for him. But how did Shi Qinghai survive those cold and silent years by himself? "I'm a professional." Shi Qinghai smiled, but his smile was a bit fierce. Perhaps even he didn't want to recall those dark days. After a pause, he continued, "I didn't suffer much in the past few months, probably after you were pardoned. In fact, I even made a few acquaintances in the Black Prison of the Fox Fortress." "You're indeed fiercer than me," Su Lu said seriously. The autumn wind gradually rose. In the quiet Charter Square, there was only the sound of President Pabre's speech on the screen and the two men whispering to each other. Lan Xiaolong, Xiong Linquan, and the rest of the 6 people stood not far away, vigilantly watching the surroundings. However, they clearly heard the conversation between Su Lu and Shi Qinghai. At this time, they had a rough idea that Su Lu had learned to call himself young master in class from this man. However, in their opinion, he was very qualified to call himself young master since he had graduated with the best grades from #1 academy, an excellent spy who traveled between the government and the anti-government army, and an awesome person who had assassinated Macklin. During the days when I was locked up, I always thought that if I could get out, I must meet someone. Guess who it is? Sure, Qinghai had lit his second cigarette at this time. He squatted by the side of the street and said. Su Lu also squatted down and replied, I don't think it's me. You're not good looking. Sure, Qinghai smiled slightly. That pair of mesmerizing peach blossom eyes gradually bloomed in the autumn wind, revealing a trace of intoxicating longing and yearning. I've already made the arrangements. Su Lu lowered his head and said, She will bring Lu Hua to see you tonight. The autumn wind was similarly bleak in front of the Shishan compound. The soldiers standing guard at the entrance and the aura of the compound of iron and blood made this bleak atmosphere even more intense. Zoe was wearing a black windbreaker today, carrying the real Lu Hua in her arms. The cold expression between her eyebrows was particularly clear and piercing because of the change in color of her clothes. The facial features of this minister's daughter always gave off a feeling of being bright and beautiful. When it came to beauty, she was really beautiful to the extreme. However, whether it was in front of people or behind the scenes, whether it was the red-clothed girl back then or the beautiful mother now, most of the time, her straight eyebrows always gave off a sense of coolness. In front of Su Lu, she actually no longer deliberately acted as a character. However, on this occasion, she put on this mask again. Su Lu walked out of the black car and smiled slightly at her. His gaze caught a trace of red from the collar of her windbreaker, the kind that was so bright that it was somewhat piercing to the eyes. The car started moving. Zoe sat in the passenger's seat and broke the silence at an unexpected point. Her voice was extremely cold. My family thinks that I'm going out to eat with you. When you bring me back later, don't let slip. I'm just going to see an old friend. Why make it seem like I'm going to war? Sula looked ahead and said, The black car stopped below a high-class apartment in the south city of the capital. Su Lu carried the child and walked into the elevator with Zoyu. The elevator only opened when it reached the top floor. Su Lu looked at Zoyu, who was walking towards the room, and felt a tinge of warmth in his heart. He softly instructed Xiong Lin Quan, who had been guarding here, about some safety matters. Just as he was about to leave, Zoyu suddenly turned around and said in an indifferent tone that left no room for doubt, Come and pick me up in an hour. Sulu was slightly stunned before nodding. Yes, there's another chapter later. There's no rush to say goodbye today. Chapter 349. This high-rise apartment looked grand, but its geographical location was not very good. If one were to calculate according to the golden line of real estate from Charter Square, the location of the apartment was still very far away from the line. Every inch of land was far from the golden line. Therefore, when the seventh young master of the Li family generously gave it to Su Lu, he did not forcefully refuse. The small-eyed man knew that the other party was making a long-term investment. Last year, he had spent tens of millions on the other party. Even if he was not a businessman, he knew that it would be very unprofessional to refuse the other party's sincere request for a follow-up investment when there was no return on the investment and the market was on the rise. A property that was worth the seventh young master of the Li family's generosity could not be expensive, but it could not be tasteless. It was just like the other penthouse that was full of oil paintings. The lower 6 floors of the high-rise apartment was the members' club. It had all kinds of facilities, and from the quality of the service staff and the details of the interior, one could tell that it was a very good place. In order to pass the time, Su Lu sat down in a bar on the lower floor of the apartment. He ordered a glass of unknown liquor and added 9 ice cubes. After the taste of the liquor had been diluted by the ice water, he began to take small sips. At the same time, he turned on the ultra-thin screen on his phone and began to seriously study some of the military courses in the 1st Military Academy. The place where he sat was very remote, and the light was dim. He wore a military uniform without epaulets and looked very ordinary. Naturally, There were no proud and lonely women who came to disturb him. To be Jian Shuainer's bodyguard? This was definitely not a real mission given to him by the Ministry of Defense. In order to protect himself and the members of the Iron 7th Division on the front line in the West Woods in the future, or perhaps because he was shocked by the commanding ability of the officers of the Iron 7th Division during the 2 military exercises on his graduation day, Sulu began to seriously study everything related to the battlefield. He did not really expect to become a qualified commander in the future, but at least he would not be so clueless as to where the planned retreat route was after being surrounded by the enemy. Sulu had always been very serious and silent when he was practicing and studying. He was fully immersed in the text data or the burning and trembling lines. But today, for some reason, he could not calm down as he stared at the teaching materials on his phone's ultra-thin screen. He kept thinking about what was happening in the penthouse at this time. What could happen in an hour? What could happen in an hour? If it was to look at each other speechlessly, choking and tearing 1,000 lines, it would only be a moment of silence between a man and a woman, and then it would be over. If it was to talk about the future, 1 hour would not be enough to begin. If it was to stand side by side in front of the bed, looking at the child's face, talking and smiling sweetly, talking about which part of the child was like you and which part of the child was like me, how long would it take? What if Zhou suddenly wanted to perform a biological excretion in front of his biological father? Perhaps his young parents would have to deal with this matter in a flurry and waste all their time. Thinking of this, Sulu couldn't help but laugh happily, but his smile immediately disappeared. From the cold mask that Zhou wore along the way and the words that he said earlier, he could clearly infer that the above story would not happen in the 1 hour in the penthouse, let alone play out the passionate scene that he had hoped for. At the end of the day, Mr. Sure and Zhou, you were just at the right place at the right time. Golden wind and rain met for one night, but they bore the wrong fruit. At most, this young man and woman were not familiar with each other at all. They had only seen each other a few times, so it could only be said that they had an occasional one-night relationship. It didn't even reach the level of sexual intimacy. Sulu lowered his eyes slightly and looked at the wine glass in his hand, feeling the coldness coming from it. He thought with some confusion, did I make a mistake when I accompanied Yuzi to give birth to the child? How could this absurd and complicated relationship be sorted out? It should be known that not every love song had a happy ending. This kind of plot only existed in TV series, and it was even more impossible for it to be as easy as the scriptwriter wrote it, which could lead to something like love. However, when he thought of Zhou Liuhua's cute yawning and drooling in his arms, Su Li's heart settled down. He thought to himself, as parents, how can you let a little life be responsible for you if you don't take good care of your own safety? You deserve all the trouble. Thinking of this, he felt relieved and even felt a sense of justice, although he knew that this sense of justice was actually very shameless. An hour later, the black car left the apartment building. The military vehicle driven by Lu Jiao carried a few men from the 7th team and followed the car from a distance to protect the safety of the people in the car. Zhou didn't sit in the passenger seat. Instead, she sat quietly in the back with Zhou Liuhua in her arms. The seat belt was tightly fastened on her body, and the red scarf around her neck was folded up like a ball of flame. I'm going to study at the National Shanglin University. After a long time, Zhou broke the silence. Looking at the side of Su Li's face, she said calmly, "You know the rules of Linhai University Town. You have to sign up in the winter." Su Li's hands on the steering wheel slightly stiffened. He could hear many meanings from these words. Shanglin University was a famous institution more than 10 kilometers away from Yue University. If Zhou wanted to continue her studies, it naturally meant that the previous conversation didn't go well. The Minister of Defense's daughter gave birth to a child out of wedlock and still hasn't gotten married after so long. This matter is indeed somewhat absurd and laughable. Zhou said lightly, "I told you before that I won't thank you for taking the blame for me, because this was your bad idea to begin with." Sula didn't know what to say. Zhou laughed self-deprecatingly. Her face was like a frosty peony blooming in the night. "But at least you helped me break a lot of things." In the future, if I can really find what I need, I do need to thank you. You don't have to worry about anything. At least now, the people outside see you as Liohua's father. In the future, the more outstanding you become in the military, the less people will dare to gossip about you. Father's side will also be slightly better. Su Lu could hear the determination and firmness in the girl's words. Just as he was about to open his mouth to say something, Zoyu stopped him. She lowered her head to look at the child in her arms and said calmly, "You hope that I can marry Shi Qinghai, but you should give up. This has nothing to do with his identity as a spy, and also has nothing to do with his family background. I just don't like this kind of playboy." Playboy is an accurate description. Su Lu smiled bitterly as he thought to himself. Zoe retracted her gaze from the child. The sweetness in her eyes instantly turned into a trace of frustration and coldness. She looked out of the window at the rapidly receding capital's night scene and didn't say anything for a long time. This girl's hazy first love, or the individual recognition under the collective consciousness, was that of the most unfathomable young master in the Federation. She had grown up in her adolescence under the guidance of a certain madam. Although behind the backs of the elders, she would often pretend to be cold, arrogant, and rebellious with that unruly elder brother. In the end, even she herself couldn't tell whether it was a kind of acting or whether she was originally such a cold and cruel person. But after all, her vision was much broader than the average girl in the Federation. Even if it couldn't compare to the galaxy above the human's head, it was still more open and honest. Once the shackles above her head were broken, it would be very difficult for her to be bound by certain worldly things, even if those traditions were extremely powerful. For example, marriage, love, and these seemingly beautiful words. Zoyu's gratitude to Su Lu was above this. Her family background, that father of hers who had been calm and steady for many years, might have been able to bind her, but it just so happened that it was forcefully pushed back by the shattered piece of celadone between her fingers and the smear of blush flowing down her cheeks. Life isn't a game of house. If you really want to walk your own path, you have to be ruthless enough. Ruthless to others, and also ruthless to yourself. Zoyu thought of the past, unexpectedly giving birth to an aura of vicissitudes that a young woman shouldn't have. She sighed softly and said to Su Lu in front of her, "You're a good person, but in this world, wanting to be a good person is the most difficult path. In the future, you have to be even more ruthless. As long as you are ruthless enough, who dares to stand in your way?" If there really was no path to walk in the future, it would just be letting go of both hands and leaping into the abyss of death in search of peace, tranquility, cleanliness, and perhaps some happiness. Was that so? Su Lu fell into silent contemplation. For some reason, Zoyu felt very angry every time she saw him in silence. She pursed her red lips and said, "Don't make yourself into a fool. Think about why the old man in Feiqing City and Mr. President promoted you so highly. Although I can't tell, you have to be careful when you go to the front line. Otherwise, who knows when someone will shoot you in the back." Sula didn't explain that his next task was to be a bodyguard. He said with a smile, "Be careful when you go to Lin Hai. Don't be as hot-tempered as before. You have to know that Mr. Sure and I are not in Lin Hai right now, so there is no one to control your temper. I don't like to see you bully others." Zoe didn't say anything. She sneered, but there wasn't too much coldness in her voice. Instead, there was a bit of reluctance and regret between friends. Late that night, Su Lu and Shi Qinghai planned to get drunk. After sobering up, they planned to be cool again. They were drunk for 17 hours in a row before they gradually sobered up. The two brothers didn't have much to say to each other after reuniting from a disaster. However, when the twilight shone on the glass of the apartment, Shi Qinghai narrowed his peach blossom eyes and looked at the burning clouds in the sky. He said somewhat absent-mindedly, "Some clouds look like George Carlin, and some clouds look like pirates. I may run into space pirates in a few days." Su Lu rubbed his face with a hot towel and looked at the details of the task he just received on his encrypted phone. He shook his head and said, "Do you want to go with me?" Shi Qinghai stretched himself exaggeratedly and paused for a moment before saying, "No, I'm going to find the organization." At this time, Su Li's phone rang again. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the message on the screen. He suddenly said, "Your organization is holding a banquet tonight. A girl who liked to wear black-rimmed glasses should also be at the banquet." Thinking of this, Sulu was silent for a long time. Time flowed like water, washing away the traces of the bitterness and heartache of his youth. However, just like the famous vinegar pickled eggplant in the West Woods, the rinsed skin didn't have much of a taste, but the inside was still so sour that it made people want to cry. Out of the 3 chapters today, this chapter is the most satisfying one. Good night, comrades. I won't canvass for votes today. Although it was destroyed, Chapter 350. After the Federation's reconciliation, the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces held a reception in the Special Capital District. The name of the reception was the Charity Gala for the Peace and Reconstruction of the 4 Prefectures. The historic handshake between President Pabble and the leader of Southern Water gave the people from Green Dragon Mountain, who came to participate in the negotiations, an unprecedented, even somewhat exaggerated, respect. There were many important guests who came to participate in this banquet. The location of the reception was also very important. In a sense, the Tai family, who had single-handedly facilitated the Federation's reconciliation, vacated the Windy Slope Clubhouse next to Charter Square to welcome guests from all over the country. 2 years ago, Mr. Pabre, who was only a member of Parliament, took a military plane to Green Dragon Mountain and laid the foundation for today's reconciliation. It was all because of the influence of the Tai family in the dark. Whether it was the current government or the people of Green Dragon Mountain, they were all sincerely grateful to that lady. Sulu and Shi Qinghai walked out of the black car. They looked at the inconspicuous main entrance of the Windy Slope Clubhouse and the extremely high night sky, and saw the line of large words formed by light beams. Charity Gala for the Peace and Reconstruction of the 4 Prefectures. They couldn't help but sigh in their hearts at the same time. Seeing this name, they couldn't help but think of the building of the foundation for the peace and reconstruction of the 4 prefectures that was full of bullets and blood. The owner of that building had climbed to a very high position in both Green Dragon Mountain and the government. Now, it had long been thrown into the dustbin of history and gradually forgotten by people. Probably only these 2 brothers would never forget this member of Parliament who had died in their hands. Su Lun naturally didn't have any objections to the Federation's reconciliation. However, he really didn't have much interest in this kind of reception. It was even more impossible for him to come here just to see the girl with the black-rimmed glasses again and let himself suffer, torture, and be artistic. However, he had received a direct order from the Ministry of National Defense. He didn't know who wanted to see him at the reception, but he couldn't refuse a military order. Shi Qinghai's situation was the same. He wanted to find his own organization, and the intelligence leader had inexplicably set the location of contact at the banquet. After finding his name in the electronic register, Su Lu led Shi Qinghai into the Lufeng Slope Club. He had been to this high-class place before, which was full of a quiet and elegant atmosphere. But today, after walking to the end, he realized that the Lufeng Slope Club had a large building at the back of the mountain. The reception was held in a hall halfway up the mountain. They found a dark seat in the hall and sat down. Shi Qinghai took a bottle of red wine from the surprised waiter and filled his and Su Li's glasses. They looked at each other, laughed at themselves, and finished the wine in one gulp. Back to the ball, 2 years ago. The legendary intelligence leader from Green Dragon Mountain had contacted the crown prince of the Tai family through Su Lu, which led to a series of political disturbances later. In a sense, Su Lu and Shi Qinghai were the key figures in the Federation's reconciliation. However, at this reception, no one would realize this, and no one would even notice their existence. It was this kind of emotion that made the 2 of them feel a little strange in the dark corner under the crystal chandelier in the bustling hall. Do you still remember the Double Moon Festival Ball 2 years ago? Shi Qinghai poured another 2 glasses of red wine and slowly swallowed them. He let the clear wine fragrance linger in his mouth and nose and said faintly, "She will definitely come tonight. Will you dance with her again?" Sula narrowed his eyes and smiled. He shook his head and said, "It's all in the past. What's there to talk about?" At this moment, the heavy door was opened, and an old man about 60 years old walked in, accompanied by a few representatives of the Federation. The guests at the 70 or so tables in the hall all stood up and applauded politely and warmly. Those who were qualified to enter the Flowing Winslow Club to participate in this charity banquet were undoubtedly the top figures in their social circles. However, at this time, their action of standing up and applauding seemed very natural. Sulu retracted his gaze from below the rostrum. He had noticed that Li Xiuzhu, Lin Dohai, and several other second-generation figures of the seven great families were sitting at the same table. However, he didn't see Li Xiaotong. It seemed that the seventh young master was not lying when he said that he and Li Xiuzhu never appeared at the same time. Not the leader of Nanshui, chairman of the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain, Jin Jifan. Shi Qinghai looked at the rippling red wine in his glass. He wondered when that wretched uncle would come to find him. He said with a trace of indifference, "The leader of Nanshui always likes to maintain a sense of mystery. Even if President Pabre were to attend this kind of occasion, he wouldn't attend. The upper class of the Federation values face the most. Since we've already signed the peace agreement, we naturally have to show respect to Green Dragon Mountain." Shi Qinghai added. There was a faint ridicule in his words. "You're a member of Green Dragon Mountain, but it seems that you don't have a good impression of the Central Committee." Sulu asked curiously. "We're an intelligence agency. We're relatively independent. Moreover, we've been active in S1 for many years. In the eyes of the Central Committee, we're naturally suspected of being traitors." The ridicule in Shi Qinghai's eyes grew stronger and stronger. "For example, the guy who asked me to come to the banquet today is nominally the number 3 figure of the Central Committee. However, in reality, his days in the mountain aren't very comfortable. But you still want to find an organization," Sula said with a smile. He shook his head and said, "Don't talk about this. I'm not interested in these things. You have to know that I'm currently an active officer of the Federation." Jin Jifan and the several important members of the Federation smiled warmly. Under the gazes of the crowd, they sat at the table in front of the podium. Just when the guests in the hall thought that President Pabre would arrive and the charity banquet would officially begin, no one expected that another pair of guests would appear at the entrance. "I originally thought that Madam wanted to push the crown prince to the stage today." Shi Qinghai looked at the pair of young guests that appeared at the entrance. A trace of disgust flashed between his eyebrows. He said, "Who would have thought that the one who came was actually this idiot?" The order of appearance at any banquet was always particular. What qualifications did the pair of young men and women that appeared at the entrance of the banquet have to be behind Jin Jifan and the several members? Who was that young man? Su Li's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man with slightly bent elbows at the entrance. The man wore a military uniform without any insignia. His figure was tall and straight, and his face was deliberately calm and reserved, as well as an air of arrogance that could not be concealed no matter what. "As I said, that's an idiot." Shi Qinghai sensed that Su Li's voice had sunk slightly, so he said with a faint mocking smile, "The second son of the leader of Nanshui, Nan Mingxiu. This good son of a revolutionary is truly arrogant to the extreme in Green Dragon Mountain. Relying on the fact that he has a good father, he actually dares to appear after Jin Jifan and put on such a show. Does he think that the capital is the same as those bare mountains?" Shi Qinghai knew what Su Lu was feeling right now, so he did not hold back in his words. He directly threw out the evaluation that the anti-government army had given this person. Most of the guests at the charity banquet did not know who this young man was. He actually dared to appear after Jin Jifan and the members of the parliament. There was a burst of discussion in the banquet hall, and the identity of this person gradually spread. Only then did the crowd gently nod, revealing a look of understanding. The guests at the banquet hall were more familiar with this young man's female companion, because this beautiful girl wearing a light blue dress had once appeared in the live broadcast of the hearing on Parliament Hill. The entire Federation had once heard her calm and firm voice. It was no exaggeration to say that this girl had many admirers in the Federation. People admired her calm and firm, and the calm beauty in front of countless members of Parliament. Especially when the Federation restarted the Medellin project last month, she once again returned to S1 Parliament Hill and showed her steady and calm side in front of countless media reporters. This admiration was further strengthened. Nan Mingxiu? Su Li's eyelashes slightly blinked. He looked at the son of the anti-government leader, looked at his slightly bent arm, looked at the small white hand in the crook of his arm, and looked at the light blue dress. This dress seemed to be a little old, and it seemed that it had not been worn for a long time. It appeared a little too plain to appear in such a luxurious and romantic occasion as the Lufeng Slope Club. Su Lu felt that this little blue dress was somewhat familiar, but she remembered in an instant. 2 years ago, she had also worn this little dress during the Double Moon Festival dance. It seems that life in the guerrilla army is really hard. He quietly looked at the girl at the door and found that she was not wearing black-rimmed glasses today. He said softly, "The female companion of the leader's son can only wear old clothes." New clothes were not as good as old clothes, but old clothes were the most comfortable to wear. A new person was a better choice. Shi Qinghai stared at the red wine in the glass, smiled slightly, and said, "Your performance is better than I thought. You can still be so calm. This is not a difficult thing to do." Su Lu steadily picked up the red wine glass. He was not pretending, whether or not he could really see through the past, but after experiencing so many life and death situations, these things seemed to be very difficult to shake his big heart. He calmly looked at Nan Mingxiu and Zhang Xiaoming holding hands, walked to the rostrum under the gaze of all the guests, and watched them sit at the table where Li Xiuzhu was sitting. After so many years of training, his mechanic eyes were even sharper. The moment Nan Mingxiu and Zhang Xiaoming sat down, he clearly saw the undisguised greed and possessiveness in this person's eyes. In an instant, Su Li's eyes narrowed, and he took a big gulp of red wine. "Calm, calm." Shi Qinghai looked at him mockingly, laughed, and said, "Didn't you say that this is not a difficult thing to do?" Su Lu put down the wine glass, narrowed his eyes, and looked at the table. He was silent for a long time and suddenly said, "But I am still not happy." Chapter 351. The guests in the Flowing Wind Slope Club maintained almost standard smiles as they looked at the MC on the stage. From time to time, they would respond to the MC's topic, making the smiles on their faces bigger or laughing out loud. As for whether they actually listened to those words, no one knew. Shi Qinghai naturally wasn't in the mood to listen to this nonsense. His eyes lifted from the 3 ancient letters LFB embroidered on the white tablecloth and fell on Su Li's face, confirming that he was still looking at the table in front of the rostrum. He said sarcastically, "She's not your woman. What's there to be upset about? The committee made her Nan Mingxiu's female companion. It's not as bad as you think. Your ex-girlfriend's beautiful appearance is mainly to fight back against the Federation's accusation of kidnapping." Su Li glanced at him. Shi Qinghai played with the stem of his cup and said, "I checked before I came. Last autumn's hearing and last month's second appearance made Zhang Xiaoming very popular with the people of the Federation. She even felt like the spokesperson of the organization. Her appearance today is naturally to let the officials of the Federation and the media see that the young people who believe in George Carlinism are all willing, not brainwashed by the mountain." "You should also believe in George Carlin," Su Lu said. "I believe in them, but I didn't join them for some ideology. Do you remember the letter I left you?" Looking at Chairman Jean Jifan and President Pa Bre on the rostrum, his face suddenly calmed down, and there was a trace of regret between his charming eyebrows. "In the past, the Federation heartlessly hurt my life, so I want to make this Federation better. People have to do something, but looking at these scenes that I would never have thought of in the past, I suddenly feel that I don't understand. In fact, I've always wondered if George Carlin, who is worshipped by countless people in the Federation, could be someone I know." The light of the giant crystal chandelier was soft and magnificent, but when it reached their table, it became a little dull, casting shadows on Su Li's ordinary face. He said in a very soft voice, "It's just that this idea is too ridiculous. Although that guy's teeth are all rotten, he doesn't look that old." Just as the two of them were sighing with mixed feelings, the charity banquet continued its own program and began to enter the auction process. The seats in the hall of Flowing Winslow Clubhouse were all fixed in advance. Only the worst seats in the outermost circle were not so strict. Of course, the guests sitting in such seats were not important figures. Even so, the guests sitting at Sue Lee's table were still famous people from South Dakota, Darcy, Hong Kong, and other places. What was even more amazing was that in the auction segment, the people who really raised their cards and threw money were all from these remote corners. It was probably because these people had money and status, but they had always lacked the opportunity to get close to the core of the federal power. In this charity auction, the two items with the highest price were a windbreaker donated by President Pabre and a gun carried by the leader of Southwater. The dark windbreaker had accompanied the dark-skinned Mr. President on that tattered military transport aircraft. On a certain New Year's night, it flew directly to Green Dragon Mountain Airport and witnessed the birth of the Federation's reconciliation agreement. It had great historical significance on an occasion like this, and it was also particularly in line with the theme of today's banquet. As for the gun donated by the leader of Southwater, it was full of rich symbolic meaning. The leader of the anti-government army had even handed over his gun. What did this mean? Warm and sincere applause resounded in the hall. Then came a series of award ceremonies. The Special Investigation Team of the Legal Department and the Editorial Department of the Capital Daily received the Federation's Special Medal. Looking at Prosecutor Xiao Wenjing, who excitedly received the award from Mr. President, Chief Editor Bob, who had a calm expression, and Reporter Wood, who was still somewhat immobile, the audience was silent for a moment, and then there was warm applause. Everyone knew what this special awards ceremony represented. The people who received the award on the stage were the staunch promoters and investigators of the Medellin Project. It was because of their tireless efforts that the Federation was able to nail Senator Medellin to the pillar of shame 20 days ago. And to receive the award on such an occasion, there was no doubt that the Federation government and the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain had reached a consensus on this matter. It was even possible that it was because of this matter that the peace agreement between the two sides was signed so smoothly. Su Lu and Shi Qinghai looked at each other. Looking at the excited Xiao Wenjing and the two respectable media people on the stage, they seriously applauded. In fact, compared to the people on the stage, the two of them should be on the stage to receive the award and bask in the warm and enthusiastic applause. It was just that no one would call their names because the things they did would never see the light of day. They could only shine in the darkness. "I like our president more and more," Shi Qinghai said with a smile while clapping. Hearing this familiar name, Su Lu replied with a smile, "I like him too." President Pabre's experience in the military was very poor. He was only a legal official who followed the army. During the election, he needed to reach a reconciliation agreement with the anti-government army. The reason he was able to successfully become the president was largely because of that explosive news incident. However, this dark-skinned president still upheld the promise he made back then. He didn't even hesitate to offend the interests of the Federation to investigate the Medellin case to the end. He gave many people, including Su Lu and Shi Qinghai, a clear explanation. This kind of tenacity and bright moral character had not been seen in a politician for a long time. Naturally, the reception couldn't always be seated. After the first half of the program ended, the service staff of the Flowing Winslow Club quickly and cleanly changed the venue. The dance floor in the middle was empty, and countless people in luxurious clothes began to exchange pleasantries with each other. President Pabre had already left in advance. Chairman Jean Jifan from Green Dragon Mountain and the son of the leader of Nanshui naturally became the focus of everyone's attention. No one knew how the anti-government army from Green Dragon Mountain would enter the Federation after the reconciliation and what kind of changes it would bring to the current political situation. No one even dared to confirm whether these mountain guerrillas could grow into some kind of political force. However, No matter if it was a politician or a businessman, they had to show their goodwill and friendliness in advance in this chaotic and uncertain situation. Shi Qinghai held a bottle of red wine and leaned against the wall in the corner with Su Lu. He drank while watching everything unfold in a bored manner. Suddenly, he saw a waiter's hand gesture under a silver plate not far away. He narrowed his eyes and whispered something to Su Lu before leaving the scene. Someone was looking for Mr. Shi. Su Lu leaned against the wall with his head down and held the bottle of red wine in boredom. He didn't know if he should leave. Why did the Ministry of National Defense want him to come to this reception? Who on earth wanted to see him? He wasn't a person who liked to drink alone, and he wasn't interested in squatting in the corner and drawing circles. Although the wallpaper pattern of Flowing Wind Slope Club was beautiful and moving, he couldn't study it for too long. In particular, when he looked at the area surrounded by people in front of the reception, at the smear of blue and the proud face of the leader's son, he felt a little frustrated. He casually put down the bottle of red wine by his feet and strolled out of the hall to the side of the terrace. The autumn night was refreshing. Occasionally, a gust of wind would come, but it actually felt a little cold. Su Lu gently held the stone railing with both hands and narrowed his eyes to look at the forest in front of him. The stars above the trees, the charter square across from the forest, and those ignorant five-person group statues. He was about to be quiet for a moment when he heard hesitant footsteps behind him. He turned around and looked at Zhang Xiaoming in the blue off-shoulder dress. After a moment of silence, he said, "Long time no see." Last year at the entrance of the Parliament building, Zhang Xiaoming looked at him with a trace of nervousness and uneasiness. Her knuckles holding the wine glass were a little white. She tidied the hair floating in front of her forehead and bravely took a step forward, getting a little closer to Su Lu. In many cases, it was difficult for young men and women to find a topic to break the silence. Perhaps they would talk about the weather or the moon, but Su Lu, he just calmly looked at this familiar and elegant face, thinking of the happiness, sadness, and deceit he once had. He directly said, "On the clock tower, you once said to me that you insisted on your beliefs, so you gave up on the relationship between us. If George Carlin found out that you appeared in the house of the 7 great families, would he jump out of his grave in anger and scold you?" He didn't question her deceit, nor did he describe what he had done to avenge her. He just asked this question so casually. However, it was this question that unabashedly revealed the depth of his heart about certain things. The late autumn night is cold. You wore a thin dress to the balcony, but you didn't have to worry about the cold, because the Thai family clubhouse is extremely extravagant with the warm air. Su Lu reached out his hand and waved gently in the warm air. Even a balcony has a warm air. Think about the days in Green Dragon Mountain. Isn't it very different? Zhang Xiaoming lowered her head slightly to hide the moisture in her eyes. She came to the balcony to say this to Su Lu, but it seemed that Su Lu didn't want to give her a chance to speak. She tightly gripped the edge of her dress with her fists. She didn't have the calm beauty in front of the Federation's television cameras. Instead, she was more like that fake mature girl from back then who was actually very stupid and naive. You should know very well that it's not like that. The Empire's invasion is imminent, she quietly explained. It wasn't clear whether she was explaining for the anti-government forces or for her own choice. No, it's Green Dragon Mountain that can't hold on any longer, so they chose to reconcile. Su Lu stared into her eyes and said somewhat angrily, "Don't forget, I knew about this matter from the beginning. I know it better than anyone. Even if what you said is true, so what?" Su Lu looked at the girl he once loved the most and lowered his eyes slightly. With a trace of mockery, he said in a deep voice, "For the sake of faith, you can give up love. For the sake of the greater good of human society, you can give up faith. Then what exactly is there that you can't give up? Faith wants you to find Tai Ziyuan, so you go find him. Faith wants you to accompany the leader's son, so you go accompany." Su Lu raised his head and continued in a cold voice. "In the past, your faith was Macklin. Now, your faith is Green Dragon Mountain. Have you ever figured out what faith is?" Every word cut to the heart, every sentence harsh. Zhang Xiaoming looked at this man's face that she had never forgotten. She was in a daze and didn't say a word. She didn't argue, nor did she get angry. She pursed her lips and smiled. Two streams of sparkling and translucent tears slid down her cheeks as she smiled. She knew better than anyone what a warm and honest man he was. Yet he said such harsh words. How deeply had she hurt him? How much suffering had she caused him? At this moment, the balcony door was pushed open again. Chapter 352. The person who walked onto the terrace was a middle-aged man wearing traditional Chinese clothing. Sulu had noticed him earlier in the hall. This person was from Green Dragon Mountain and was probably Nan Mingxiu's attendant. He didn't know why he had come to the terrace at this time. Zhang Xiaoming was quietly looking at Su Li's face and didn't notice that someone had come behind her. Tears flowed down her smiling face. The light makeup on her face was washed away, making her look even more beautiful. She took another step forward and leaned closer to Su Li. She said softly, "I'm sorry." There was no doubt that in this tender relationship that started with a bag of dog biscuits, started with the food in the cafeteria, and ended with the porridge and flowers in the plum garden, there had been feelings of guilt, persistence, and hurt, but there had also been unquestionable sincerity. Tonight, without the cover of her black-rimmed glasses, the hazy tears in her bright eyes seemed so sincere. Looking at her in a daze, Su Lu suddenly recalled many things in the past, many things that he rarely thought of in the past year. His strong heart didn't soften, but it recovered a trace of vitality. Then he thought of the thousands of gazes in front of the Parliament building. Many complex emotions entangled his heart, and he couldn't taste that feeling no matter how hard he tried. The lights in the hall shone through the side door, casting a shadow of a moon and a half on the quiet and dim terrace. Su Lu and Zhang Xiaoming happened to be standing on either side of this moonlike light. An invisible line seemed to separate the two of them, but in reality, they were only 2 steps apart. The scene fell into silence and silence, as if they had returned to the cafeteria and the playground 3 years ago. Zhang Xiaoming wiped away the tears at the corners of her eyes and quietly looked at him with a smile. Although they were no longer in a relationship of the past, just standing there facing each other and looking at his face, so close was already a great comfort for her. She knew how hard he had been through these past few years. Although she had also been through the same in the mountains, she no longer had the right to complain, and he didn't seem to have the desire to talk about these things. So she just stood there quietly, standing in the autumn wind on the terrace. There was no need for words, just reminiscing about the past. However, there were other people on the terrace. The middle-aged man in formal attire was a little surprised to see Zhang Xiaoming crying and wiping her tears. His expression changed slightly, and he was prepared to come forward and say a few words to her. He wanted to tell her that someone was looking for her in the hall, and at the same time, he wanted her to stay away from the cold and dangerous officer by the stone railings. In his opinion, that officer must have done something to make Zhang Xiaoming cry like this. This pair of young man and woman were silently reflecting on the atmosphere when suddenly there was another person who disturbed them. Zhang Xiaoming's back was facing the side door, so she did not notice. Su Lu coldly looked at the middle-aged man. It was just a glance, but the coldness and ruthlessness in his eyes made the middle-aged man stop in his tracks. His heart was cold, and he turned around and walked toward the hall. Nan Mingxiu is the son of Nanshui's leader. Me being his female companion today is the request of the organization, but don't misunderstand. It's just that recently, the Federation, Zhang Xiaoming's eyes were slightly red as she looked at him and quietly explained. The story between her and him was too long and too complicated. Originally, there was no need to explain anything, but for some reason, when she saw Su Li's normally sunny and gloomy face today, her heart was particularly flustered. She always felt that she had to explain clearly. You don't need to explain anything. Su Lu calmly looked at her elegant face. Zhang Xiaoming's heart was slightly gloomy, but she immediately forced a smile. In an instant, this smile became particularly gentle because Su Lu placed his hand on her head and gently stroked it. When I found out last year that you were still alive, I was very angry. Su Lu somewhat slowly withdrew his hand and said, "But Mr. Sure reminded me that if I was more angry than happy, then wouldn't that mean that I was looking forward to your death? You should be angry." Zhang Xiaoming walked out of the half-moon-shaped lights and walked to his side. She quietly leaned on his arm and said, "Looking at you across the street on the sidewalk, only then did I realize how much my heart hurt. I always wanted to ask you face to face if you could forgive me, but later I thought it through. What reason do I have for you to forgive me?" She tilted her head and looked at Su Li's side profile with some bitterness. She stubbornly smiled and said, "I know your personality. You hate it when people lie to you." Su Lu had once said to Lin Yuanhu in front of Professor Shin's grave that he would not forgive a single one of them. Now, Lin Yuanhu had also become an ice-cold existence in the grave. As for Zhang Xiaoming, he didn't think there was any question of forgiveness. It was just that the affairs of the world and each of them had their own obsessions. However, in a relationship, there was no room for obsessions about other things, even if it was so-called faith. Besides, the past was the past, and it could never be returned. In the cold wind of the autumn night, he felt a little cold. He lowered his head to look at the girl beside him and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Remember what we said on the Iron Tower? The love that I have looked forward to since I was young cannot be sacrificed by anything. If the bargaining chip is also the most beautiful thing in the world, I will try to grasp it together." After all, not many people would ask such a stupid question as a mother and wife falling into a river. His tone gradually became serious, and with a trace of painful self-mockery, he said, "The love that I want is the kind that is absolutely selfish. It's funny to say that I set obstacles for myself to judge what love is. At that time at Yue University, I thought that no matter if you were a spy for the anti-government army or something else, I would still be the same as before. I also hoped that even if I were a traitor, you would still love me the same. At that time, I always thought that this kind of love was real." Not many young men and women could still analyze their own psychology so seriously and sincerely on the balcony on an autumn night after experiencing their story. Maybe Su Lu was naive, or maybe Zhang Xiaoming was childish. Maybe their meeting on the bus at the airport was a mistake in itself. Maybe Zhang Xiaoming did a lot of things to hurt Su Lu. But in the end, the reason why they could meet and love each other in a sea of people as vast as the stars was because they were actually very similar people in their bones. "I've always been the one to leave quietly. I've always been the one to hurt you time and time again." Zhang Xiaoming was slightly disappointed. Then she raised her head and said sadly, "I'm sorry." Su Lu narrowed his eyes and said, "This is the second sentence today. I told you before that I don't like to hear you say sorry the most." "Yes." Zhang Xiaoming playfully pursed her lips, but with her pair of red eyes, she looked a little sad. She didn't feel relieved. On the contrary, because of Su Li's current calmness, there was a lot of bitterness and sadness hidden in her heart. She didn't want to continue this topic to avoid losing control of her emotions. She hugged the boy beside her and cried loudly. She changed the topic and said softly, "Are you going to Westwoods?" Su Lu thought of the weird security mission at the Whitewater Company. He shook his head and said, "I have to go in the end. It's just that the time hasn't been set yet." "You are a talent that the federal military is focused on cultivating," Zhang Xiaoming said softly. Zhang Xiaoming said softly, "Although I don't know what happened to you in the past 2 years, it's always better to be careful on the battlefield. In the past 2 years, I've seen quite a few battles in Green Dragon Mountain. I know that it's not a place where one person can solve a problem." After saying this, she smiled slightly. She didn't tell Su Lu that she might also be transferred to the Westwoods next year. In her heart, she didn't think she had the right to ask for anything, so she was silent. But then she thought that to be able to go through hardships with the man she loved was probably a kind of happiness. Su Lu heard the deep concern in these calm words. His heart trembled slightly. He only felt that the cold autumn wind blowing in his face was like yesterday. The moonlight in the sky was like yesterday, like pear blossoms, like the snow in the Plum Garden apartment. He couldn't help but ask in a slightly raspy voice, "I've always wanted to ask you a question. In your heart, What exactly am I? The door to the terrace was forcefully pushed open. A few guests walked in quickly. The one in the front was the son of the South Water leader, Nan Mingxiu. Wearing a strange military uniform, his face was full of shock. He quickly walked to Zhang Xiaoming's side. Seeing the girl's red eyes, he reached out and grabbed Zhang Xiaoming's upper arm. He said loudly, "Xiaoming, what happened?" The moment Nan Mingxiu's fingers touched Zhang Xiaoming's upper arm, Sula didn't know why. He felt like his heart was covered in thorns. He was very angry. His eyes narrowed sharply, and he slapped down with his palm. With a crisp slap, a red mark appeared on the back of Nan Mingxiu's hand. He staggered back 2 steps. He was greatly shocked. He looked at Su Lu and angrily yelled, "Let go of her!" The people who came to the terrace all sucked in a breath of cold air. Previously, they had received the report from the middle-aged man in the hall. Only then did they know that Zhang Xiaoming, who they had invited to talk with, was crying on the terrace. She seemed to have been harassed by someone. They were very clear about Nan Mingxiu's intentions of calling this busybody the Leaf of Green Dragon Mountain. Naturally, they wanted to satisfy his desire to protect this flower. They hurriedly came to the terrace, but they never would have thought that the officer standing in the shadows would silently and unceremoniously make a move. In the opinion of this leader's son, this officer must have harassed Zhang Xiaoming. He stood on the side of reason. Moreover, the current Federation government needed his father's help. He was naturally unstoppable in the capital ring. Who would dare not give him some leeway? "I'm warning you." Nan Mingxiu stared coldly at Su Lu. "I'm warning you. Don't bother Zhang Xiaoming in the future. Otherwise, I'll make the South Water leader regret having only 2 sons." Su Lu looked at Nan Mingxiu and said, the people on the terrace were in an uproar. They didn't understand why the lines seemed to be reversed. Moreover, who was this officer? It seemed that he knew who Nan Mingxiu's father was, yet he still dared to threaten him at such a sensitive time. "How dare you be so rude to young Master Nan? What is this place? Put away those damn things in the barracks." An angry shout came from behind the terrace. The person who spoke was the chairman of the Senate's Ethics Committee, Senior Senator Zion. At this time, many people in the hall had noticed the conflict on the terrace. This respected senator just happened to be nearby, and when he saw Su Lu make a move, he unhappily lectured. Su Lu took a step forward and shielded Zhang Xiaoming behind him. He narrowed his eyes and looked at this really powerful big shot. He said, "What's wrong? You want to label me as the one who destroyed the Federation's reconciliation?" At this time, the light shone on his body, illuminating the well-ironed lieutenant colonel military uniform exceptionally clearly. At this time, the people at the side door of the terrace saw the officer's face clearly and also saw his epaulets clearly. Everyone was shocked into silence. There were only 2 such young lieutenant colonels in the Federation. No matter which one of them, it seemed that they had enough background and strength to show such a strong attitude. No matter how big of a label Senator Zion put on them, they probably wouldn't even frown. Chapter 353. When the Federation did not find any enemies in the vast universe, the army was just a dispensable existence for this society. However, with the sudden appearance of the Empire in the Night Scorpion Nebula, everything changed. The voice of the military was unprecedentedly powerful within the Federation, especially with the appearance of the war god in Philadelphia. The Federation soldiers were generally welcomed and respected by the people and the society. The military strength of the Federation expanded like a balloon. In just a few decades, the military was crazily expanded. Because of the rapid expansion, the organization and military ranks were somewhat chaotic. But no matter how chaotic it was, the 2 bars and 2 stars on the shoulders of this officer still shocked and astonished the guests of the Lufeng Slope Club. There was only one major general in the Federation military, Du Shaoqing. The rest of the division generals were all colonels. However, the officer on the terrace was obviously only about 20 years old. How could he be a lieutenant colonel at such a young age? The people who were qualified to attend the banquet all had their own information channels. After a brief moment of absent-mindedness, they immediately reacted. There were only two such young lieutenant colonels in the Federation. One of them was Li Feng, and the other was Su Lu. The former was the grandson of the Federation's war god, Li Pifu. According to many information channels, the latter seemed to have an unclear relationship with the old man in Philadelphia. According to the political system of the Federation, Mr. Zien, the chairman of the Ethics Committee of the Parliament, was undoubtedly a real big shot who could be ranked in the top 20. But at this moment, when Su Lu said this, the old senator suddenly felt depressed and could not say anything. 2 years ago, Li Feng broke into Parliament Hill and beat up the people in Senator Zien's office. Senator Zien had always remembered the scene that made him extremely angry. Li Feng was not a real lunatic, so he naturally did not dare to be rough with him. However, he beat up several of Senator Zien's aides and secretaries. No media dared to report this incident. Who would have thought that it would become a story of Li Feng beating up a senator? Looking at Su Lu, Councilman Zien was not as calm as he appeared to be. The appearance of lunatically in Feiqing City had already made him lose face. This Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu was not known as a lunatic, but a big shot like him naturally knew what this person had done. The terrace did not become absolutely silent. Everyone looked at Su Lu under the light with complicated expressions. There were whispers behind the crowd. This is Su Lu who broke the Iron 7th Division. I heard that even Li Feng was defeated by him. I don't know what his relationship is with the people in Philadelphia. Nan Mingxiu noticed the strange gazes of the people around him, but did not hear the whispers. He just angrily guessed the background of the young officer standing in front of Zhang Xiaoming. He actually dared to talk back to the old senator with one sentence. But looking at Zhang Xiaoming, standing quietly behind Su Lu, the gloominess on his face became more and more obvious. In the hall behind the terrace, under the cover of an evergreen plant, Li Xiuzhu quietly looked at the disturbance not far away. A trace of complicated emotions flashed across his handsome and charming face. No one knew if he was thinking of the stories related to the presidential election in the past 2 years. Beside him, Lin Dohai glared fiercely at Su Lu on the terrace and said, "You don't want to go out?" From the first time he saw Su Lu in Harbor City, to the nightclub next to Capital University, and then to the Flowing Wind Slope Club last winter, every time the heir of the Lin family saw Su Lu, he would be unlucky and lose face. Last year at this door, he was even smashed in the nose by Su Lu with a wine glass. As the heir of one of the 7 families of the Federation, Lin Dohai could never imagine that there would be someone in the world who dared to disrespect and even insult him, let alone a small figure like Su Lu. However, at that time, Su Lu had the wife of the back mountain of Macho behind him. Now, that wife might have abandoned him, but in the end, he climbed up the mountain of the Lees of Philadelphia. There were very few people the Lin family did not dare to provoke, but the 2 families of the back mountain of Macho and the Lake of Philadelphia were existences they absolutely did not want to provoke. Every time he thought of this, Lin Dohai could not help but hate Su Li's bullsh *T luck. At this time, seeing that this person seemed to have offended Representative Zien and the people of Green Dragon Mountain, he could not help but feel schadenfreude and was ready to do something. What are we going out for? Li Xiuzhu held a wine glass and looked at the crowd on the terrace, laughing self-deprecatingly. Few of the thousands of generations of descendants like them were as stupid as Lin Dohai, who did not know how to write the word low-key and could not even see the general situation clearly. The second-generation descendants of the 7 families could not possibly like, and even somewhat despise, Nan Mingxiu, the son of the leader of Green Dragon Mountain. At this time, standing beside Nan Mingxiu on the terrace were some playboys. Madman Li only hit a representative, but Su Lu dared to kill a representative. The difference is too big, Li Xiuzhu said with slight mockery. Representative Zien is probably thinking about where to find a way out of this situation. Representative Zien was a big shot. He was standing too high, so it was difficult for him to find a suitable way out of this situation. He was not a guest from Green Dragon Mountain like Nan Mingxiu, who could play the crude and direct role of a revolutionary from time to time, and he could not just leave like that. Therefore, even though he knew that the young lieutenant colonel in front of him was a person that the old man had carefully cultivated, after a moment of silence, he still scolded him in a displeased tone like an elder. "What is the occasion today? Why do you have a conflict with a guest who has come from afar?" Sula narrowed his eyes slightly. Since the big shot did not throw that hat at him, he naturally wanted to wait for him to answer and then gradually resolve this matter. The shrewdness of a politician was fully displayed at this moment. "I was chatting with a friend, and then someone suddenly rushed over to disturb us. That is the whole thing," Sula replied. Since he had recognized the old man as a distant relative in the military prison of Qingsheng, he had enough background and confidence in the Federation. However, he also knew that if a real big shot like Representative Zian was willing to make some concessions at this moment, and he still wanted to be aggressive, the old man would probably not agree. Representative Zian's expression slightly relaxed, and he slightly nodded. When he was about to say something, Nan Mingxiu unexpectedly interrupted him gloomily. "Friend, I only saw you harassing the female soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain." Councilman Zian's expression didn't change, but his mood sank. His second sentence had already been smoothed out and softened without leaving a trace. Lieutenant Colonel Su in front of him also gave a very polite response, seeing that he was about to build a high staircase and then leave quietly. Who would have thought that this stupid leader's son would actually add an extremely inappropriate sentence at this moment? "I think this should be a misunderstanding. This is a matter between young people. If we talk it out, we will let it go. Mr. Representative, I am late. Please introduce Chairman Jean to me." Just as the atmosphere on the balcony was weird, and everyone was silent and uneasy, a clear and gentle voice suddenly sounded from the side door. The crowd separated, revealing a young woman behind. This young woman had soft eyebrows and gave people a feeling of friendliness. However, her occasionally moving eyes revealed a sense of pride that made people unable to resist too much. A person who could speak at this time and place was naturally not a small figure. Su Li's pupils slightly shrank, and he recognized that this young woman was Mrs. Zhong, whom he had not seen for many years. Mrs. Zhong looked at Su Lu and nodded with a smile. Counselor Zion smiled and left with Madame Zhong. With her status, she could move extremely high stone steps with just a few words. This experienced and steady counselor would naturally not stand on this balcony and feel the chill and uneasiness in the wind. Looking at the back of the representative who was walking away, Nan Mingxiu was slightly stunned, feeling that she had been neglected, scorned, and humiliated. When she was about to speak, the middle-aged man beside her, who was wearing a pair of traditional Chinese clothes, suddenly leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Her gloomy face slightly stiffened, but she forced herself to hold it back. A part of the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain was to be transferred to the West Woods to fight, and that lady was the wife of that tiger. Moreover, the Zhong family in the West Woods was the only family with military power among the 7 families. That tiger was sometimes unwilling to give face even to the president, let alone Green Dragon Mountain. Although Nan Mingxiu, the leader's son, was used to being arrogant, he also knew that the lady was someone who could not be offended. However, the gloominess and anger in his heart became deeper because of the departure of Representative Zian. He looked at Zhang Xiaoming behind Su Lu and said coldly, "Comrade Zhang Xiaoming, I think you need to explain the relationship between you and this Federation officer." Although the reconciliation of the Federation was a foregone conclusion, Zhang Xiaoming, who was known as the Leaf of Green Dragon Mountain, had a complicated relationship with a Federation officer. How would the organization view Zhang Xiaoming? How would she live in Green Dragon Mountain in the future? Who knew how much insidiousness and viciousness was hidden in Nan Mingxiu's question? Su Li's eyes suddenly narrowed. He felt that his hair was about to stand up, and his fists hanging by his side slowly clenched. "Secretary Nan, please understand your position." Zhang Xiaoming, who had been silent all this time, walked to Su Li's side and said calmly, "I belong to the 4 departments. First, I am not under your jurisdiction. Second, my rank is higher than yours. Why should I explain it to you? Previously, Zhang Xiaoming had been quietly watching the play on the terrace. The reason why she did not open her mouth to explain was because she believed that Su Lu could solve this problem. She was willing to let Su Lu solve this problem, and some of the information that Su Lu had shown made her feel happy, comforted, and even a little proud of him. However, Nan Mingxiu's insidious question made her very angry. She did not want Su Lu to be held accountable by the federal military for beating up the leader's son, so she calmly stood up. The current her was no longer the her of the past. Any of her calm rhetorical questions made Nan Mingxiu's expression become even uglier. Nan Mingxiu did not have any specific position in Green Dragon Mountain. Right now, he was Chairman Jin Jifan's secretary in name. However, he was the most beloved son of the leader of Southern Water, so he often shamelessly called himself the spokesperson of the organization. Zhang Xiaoming's calm rhetorical questions actually made it impossible for him to step down. Zhang Xiaoming calmly looked at the people on the terrace, and then she raised her head to look at Su Lu. She smiled slightly and said, "But I don't want you to misunderstand him. In fact, it was I who came to the terrace to find him. He is my ex-boyfriend." Su Lu looked at Nan Mingxiu's stunned face, and endless loathing grew in his heart. He quietly added, "Ex-boyfriend can also be said to be an old lover. We are old lovers reminiscing. What does that have to do with you?" Chapter 354. What does it have to do with you? It's none of your damn business. The entire sentence was said normally, without a single curse word. Obviously, hidden in his words were the sharp thoughts of a young male animal instinctively having when looking at the gentleness he once had. There was even a hint of indecency in it. However, it carried a biting cold force that was as spicy as a scallion. It was done in one breath, incisively and incisively, and there was not a trace of pettiness in it. Ex-girlfriend, old lover. In short, I am close to her. The rest of the people on the balcony are superfluous. You guys came to my territory to disturb me. Why should I restrain myself from being presumptuous and make myself unhappy? In the training base, Su Lu dared to force Du Shaoqing to not flip out. After that long conversation, he actually had an indescribable air of a military camp. He had a bit more in common with the tiger of the West Woods, whom he had never met before. This time, most of the people on the balcony were playboys, successful people who watched coldly from the sidelines. They were tens of thousands of light years away from Du Shaoqing, this kind of iron-blooded teacher. Su Li's words burst out with a resounding clang. How could the people watching the show still have the face to look? Those who recognized his identity and background and wanted to get close to him would have to find another time. In an instant, the crowd was blown away by the rain and wind. Only a handful of people remained. Even the playboys left the balcony somewhat unwillingly, but not daring to stay. Nan Mingxiu stood in the middle of the balcony with a gloomy face. What Zhang Xiaoming said earlier was tantamount to a slap in his face. Su Li's following words directly slapped him to the ground. As the most beloved son of the leader of Green Dragon Mountain, when had he ever been humiliated like this? Although Nan Mingxiu knew that the lieutenant colonel in front of him definitely had a great background, he was still a person who was used to being unruly in Green Dragon Mountain. He was unwilling to leave in shame. In that mountain, there was no charter or law, only the regulations of the Central Committee and the voice of some uncles as the basis for doing things. Speaking of which, although Nan Mingxiu was arrogant and was considered an idiot by both Shi Qinghai and Zhang Xiaoming, he was not completely brainless. Therefore, he decided to find a suitable way to leave here. In the future, he would think of a way to kindly educate Zhang Xiaoming, who had a somewhat weak revolutionary will, and severely punish Su Lu, who was a lackey of the Federation's shameless leader. Having made up his mind and decided to leave, Nan Mingxiu was so angry that he laughed. He was about to say something and leave, but who knew that Su Lu saw his smile and added, "You also know that you are ridiculous?" Before he could put on the demeanor of a leader's son, Su Li's seemingly mild but actually sharp words blocked him back. Nan Mingxiu only felt that his chest was tight, and he was about to lose control of his anger. He angrily raised his head, pointed at Su Li's nose, and said, "Are all the officers of the Federation?" Su Li still did not let him finish the sentence. He said, "The last person who pointed at my nose had his finger broken like a crisp radish." This was true. In a certain coffee shop in Harbor City, a certain nutshell manager arranged by the Thai family had once pointed at Su Li's nose with contempt. In the end, Secretary Bai had gently gripped his finger and fiercely broke it. There was a saying that killing too many people gave off a murderous aura. This saying was not true, but people who had seen a lot of life and death would naturally be able to see bones as pillows and living people as corpses. They would be able to swallow thousands of miles away like a hungry tiger, and their mind would be as calm as the bright moon and the great river. They would be able to see everything lightly, and they would naturally be fearless and frightening. After escaping from Donglin for 3 years, Su Li had experienced so many things. Although he was still far from reaching this state, there was always a trace of such a feeling in his bones. What's more, what he said was true, so it wasn't a verbal threat used by rich playboys to win a battle. It was filled with a sense of certainty and reality. If he said he would break your finger might really break in the next moment. Nan Mingxiu grew up in Green Dragon Mountain, but she had never had the opportunity to see the rain of bullets, the real battlefield of Chiqua. She stared blankly at Su Li, listened to his indifferent words, and felt the slightly cold calmness that made one's heart palpitate. Unexpectedly, her heart subconsciously shrank, her body trembled, and she put down her arm. Frightened by his words, she put down her hand. The leader's face was burning hot, as if he had been slapped 3 times. His facial features were even somewhat twisted with anger. This face was not very good-looking, so Su Li did not look at it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the figures of Li Xiuzhu and Lin Dohai behind the window. He said to him, "Do you think those aristocratic children are really willing to get close to you? No, they have never really looked up to you. In the past few years, their families desperately wanted your father to die, but now they have become your friends. Don't you think this is a very absurd thing?" He narrowed his eyes slightly and took a deep breath of the autumn night air. The cool and refreshing air was very comfortable. Apart from the flash of memories of Secretary Bai in his mind, the complicated emotions that had arisen from his reunion with Zhang Xiaoming finally cleared up a lot because of venting. Humiliating people you hate is perhaps the best way to get a good mood. At this time, Su Li thought of what Shi Qinghai had said at the banquet. He vaguely understood that if one was not afraid of people, then naturally one could be at ease. This was related to one's status in society, to one's strength, and most closely related to one's temperament. No longer paying attention to the other people on the terrace, Su Li looked at Zhang Xiaoming and said calmly, "If there is trouble in the future, you know how to find me." Zhang Xiaoming made a sound of agreement through her nose. Her soft and gentle voice became a little sour in the night wind. She took his military cap from the stone railing. Su Li slightly paused and lowered his head. She carefully tidied his sideburns and made sure that every strand of hair was caught in the brim of the cap and would not be messy. Only then did she put down her hands with satisfaction. The two of them stood very close to each other in this position. They could smell each other's breath. They were not strangers, but they were not familiar either. However, they were very close. Su Li quietly let her do this, and then slightly opened his arms. Zhang Xiaoming took a step forward, hugged him, and gently leaned on his chest without saying anything. He carefully kissed the girl's smooth forehead, then turned and left the terrace. There were other people on the terrace, but Su Li and Zhang Xiaoming didn't see anyone else. They naturally hugged and said goodbye. Zhang Xiaoming didn't even look at Nan Mingxiu's gloomy face. She just narrowed her eyes like a young man and looked at his back as he walked away. A slightly bitter smile appeared on her lips. In her heart, she softly answered the question that Su Li didn't have a chance to ask. "In my heart, of course you are the most important part. A young man with no background can now make Madame Zhong come out to protect him. He can make Senator Xian not want to be too harsh." Li Xiuzhu looked at Su Li, who disappeared at the entrance of the stairs, and said quietly, From the Tai family to the Li family, how can he be appreciated by so many people? Of course, it's not as simple as luck. Lin Daohai was about to refute, but he noticed that young Master Li seemed to be reflecting and analyzing something, not asking for his opinion. The so-called big shots in the Federation respect his background, but fear his methods. Methods are not the methods to kill people, but other things, including his ruthlessness. This kind of person who doesn't follow the rules, like your brother, will only give countless people headaches. The problem is that your brother's surname is Lin, so the elders have to show tolerance and kindness. But what about him? Lin Daohai's expression changed. Li Xiuzhu continued, I heard that His Excellency the President also admires him. Speaking of which, who doesn't want to have a genius mechanic who can make MX and has such terrifying combat power? But last year, you said here that as long as someone like Su Lu enters the Federation system, he will no longer be a threat because he has to follow the rules. Lin Daohai didn't agree with Li Xiuzhu's opinion. But the problem is that the old man who brought him into the Federation system is himself the biggest rule of the Federation. Li Xiuzhu hid the trace of ridicule in his eyes. The Li and Lin families have been good friends for generations, and he didn't want to humiliate Lin Daohai too much. He just thought that the Lin family had a person like Lin Banshan, but how could they have such an idiot like Lin Daohai? Could it be that the Lin family, other than the distant Lin Yuanhu, had been taken away by that broken door? People with guns speak louder. That tiger in the West Woods is like that, and that old man is even more so. He can control the most guns, and his voice in the Federation is the loudest. As long as he doesn't die, he still thinks highly of Su Lu. This Federation, including our family, can only watch this small-eyed man climb up step by step, Li Xiuzhu said with some regret. In a remote corner of the mountain forest of the Flowing Wind Slope Club, the automatic dishwasher was making a low humming sound. This place was dirty and filthy, and the overflowing foam formed a sharp contrast with the grand hall that was not far away. Of course, those important guests naturally wouldn't appear in this place. An old dishwasher with white hair and a face full of traces of suffering withdrew his gaze from the terrace. It was completely different from his aura. He shook his head like a poet and said with emotion, People say that it's always good to have a lover who is old. The most important thing is that you can't forget your first love. The story between your friend and my student really makes me, an old man with a heart of stone, feel sad and unbearable. Shi Qinghai was bored to death with a cigarette in his mouth. He squatted beside him and vaguely cursed a few vulgarities. He wasn't surprised at all that this intelligence leader of the anti-government army didn't appear at the banquet, but in this shabby place. Even if the Green Dragon Mountain and the government had fully reconciled, the anti-government army still had to leave some power to protect themselves. I saw your first love, your old lover, in that S2 nightclub. That's Sister Ko. He said sarcastically, Don't think that I don't know anything. I'm warning you. Don't even think about pushing Zhang Xiaoming back to Su Li's side. Even though she's your favorite student now, in my eyes, she's still that stupid, naive student who can't accomplish anything. This legendary intelligence leader looked at Shi Qinghai with a smile and said, Xiaoming has been with me for 2 years, and she has improved a lot. I'm going to recommend her to take over my position. Shi Qinghai's hand froze. He didn't hold the cigarette, and the red but fell into the foamy sewage. Chapter 355. Are you joking? Shi Qinghai was no longer smiling. His beautiful eyes had a trace of seriousness and seriousness. He said, How old is she? How many years has she been in the mountain? What qualifications does she have? Do you think the committee will agree to your recommendation? I think those old guys will think you are crazy. I'm not asking her to join the Central Committee. There was no record of this person in the Federation. Even the Green Dragon Mountain only referred to him as a legend. It seemed that he could disguise himself as any person he wished. He had once claimed to be a mountain person, but the Tai family's crown prince had still managed to find out the name that was closest to the truth. Mr. Zhong Kai. Mr. Zhong Kai smiled and said, The position of the standing committee is vacant. Who will replace me? This is something that the Central Committee needs to consider. As for the position of the chairman of the Internal Affairs Committee, I'm sure Brother Nan Shui has his own ideas. What I want to do is to let Xiao Meng become the section chief of Section 4. Shi Qinghai sighed softly. After hearing this explanation, his mood calmed down a lot. Otherwise, he wouldn't feel at ease handing over the intelligence network of the organization to that stupid woman. However, I've spent a few decades building the network within the Federation. I plan to hand it over to her. Of course, this will be done in secret. As if guessing what Shi Qinghai was thinking, Mr. Zhong Kai smiled faintly and added another sentence. Shi Qinghai was about to take out his cigarette case and light up a second cigarette when he heard this. He angrily threw the cigarette case in his hand to the ground and said in a low voice, "Are you crazy? Do you want all the fish in the sea to die?" The anti-government army was able to hold on in Green Dragon Mountain for so many years largely because of the intelligence network that this man had built. No one knew how many people within the Federation government were secretly helping him. Shi Qinghai and his teacher should be the most successful branch of this network. However, even he only knew that this intelligence network was a vast ocean. He was only a bubble within it. Yet, this man actually said that he wanted to hand over this life and death ocean to that woman. First, she has no professional training. Second, she is stupid. Third, she is a woman. Shi Qinghai's face was gloomy. He didn't expect to hear such bad news when he met with the organization today. He didn't hold back. Don't think that you can look down on all the women in the world just because you got the daughter of the Minister of Defense pregnant. Mr. Zhong Kai picked up a towel and wiped his hands. He smiled and said, "Women are more delicate than men. I've taught her for 2 years. How? I think you know your friend's personality very well." Mr. Zhong Kai smiled and said, "If something really happened to Zhang Xiaoming and she was facing death, even if Su Lu was in the Westwoods, I think he would still come back to save her." Shi Qinghai fell silent. After thinking carefully, he knew that his judgment was correct. In his eyes, if Zhang Xiaoming was a woman as stupid as a donkey, then Su Lu was undoubtedly a man who was calm and intelligent to the extreme. However, once he was impulsive, he would also turn into a donkey. His eyes gradually became cold. He looked at the empty balcony in the distance and thought of the previous scene. He said coldly, "She knows your arrangement. Is that why she met with Su Lu?" No. You are insulting the 2 beautiful words of old lover and first love." Mr. Zhong Kai stared at Shi Qinghai angrily. "There's another important reason for choosing Zhang Xiaoming, because I trust her." The old man's voice suddenly became light. He looked at Shi Qinghai and said, "In fact, I also trust you. But how can you be at ease with this kind of work? So, I have arranged something else for you. Of course, if you are willing to take over my position, I will not hesitate to change my original idea." "What are you doing?" he asked. "Only a dog would do it," Shi Qinghai replied. "Even if you don't do it, someone will do it, right?" he said with a hint of vicissitudes. "Help her more in the future." Shi Qinghai was silent. He asked, "What kind of work did you arrange for me? You know, I have just been pardoned. Who knows how many people in the Federation are watching me?" "You will go to the Westwoods," he said slowly. "The agreement between the mountain and the government is being implemented one by one. Although I trust President Pabre more, he is still a politician. There are shadows of his wife and many influential people behind him. The troops in the mountain will be transferred to the West Woods to resist the Empire. Whether the equipment promised by the Federation government can be implemented, and whether the promise to not mix in with the sand can be implemented, you need to investigate, see, and report back. I heard that there was a job called inspecting the army during the dynasty." Shi Qinghai pursed his thin lips and said self-deprecatingly, "Although I have harmed many good families, I don't need to suffer like this." Mr. Zhong Kai smiled and said, "I think because of what happened 2 years ago, President Pabre should have an impression of you. So, It will be easy for the government to accept you as the liaison officer. In addition to your relationship with Su Lu, you will have an innate advantage in the West Woods. Shi Qinghai was silent for a long time. He nodded and didn't bargain. He just looked at the old man with a complicated expression. Then he walked down the steps, picked up the cigarette box from the pool of dirty water, and painstakingly found 2 cigarettes that weren't wet. He lit one for himself and respectfully lit one for the old man. Mr. Zhongkai took a deep puff of the cigarette and was very satisfied. He said with a smile, "You only smoke number 37 cigarettes. As a spy, this is also a loophole. To be an excellent spy, you can't have a hobby that others know about. When I entered this profession, I stopped smoking and drinking. Of course, I can smoke and drink at the same time." These words were a bit difficult to understand, but a professional like Shi Qinghai could easily understand. The old man turned his head and looked gently at Shi Qinghai. "Your teacher was one of the first people I developed in the Federation. I didn't expect you to grow up so quickly. Now that we are old, the future depends on you." After saying this, he handed over a cold little tool and said, "This thing is very useful. The instructions to use it are embedded in the screen. I've already done the information separation. When you open it for the first time, all you need to do is imprint your fingerprint on it." Shi Qinghai took the item with the cigarette in his mouth and put it in his pocket. Looking at the man's thin body, for some reason, he felt that the man's body overlapped with his teacher's fat body. His heart ached, and he could no longer suppress the question in his heart. He asked calmly, "Today, you seem to be making arrangements for your death? What exactly happened in the mountains? Could it be that those old bastards have started a purge again? But Nanshui has always trusted you. You've been sitting peacefully in the wind for so many years. Could it be that something has happened this time? You're thinking too much. The mountains are no longer the mountains of many years ago. The only time you entered the mountains for training was when you encountered the last purge. No wonder you've always had a shadow in your heart." Mr. Zhongkai smiled gently and explained, "Furthermore, even if there are some internal conflicts, those of us who have survived must always persist in doing some right things. Just like this time when the Empire invaded. As a part of humanity, of course we have to contribute. But how to strike the enemy and protect ourselves in the cruel war is another difficult problem. Who knows whether or not the government forces will shoot us in the back. We have to leave behind a spark for the cause of justice. We can't let the Federation treat us like a dish delivered to the bastards of the Empire. And this is your mission in the West Woods." "I'm asking you what's wrong," Shi Qinghai asked. "We can't retire in this line of work. Since I'm preparing to hand over my shift, naturally I'm going to die." He smiled as if he was talking about someone else. He looked at Shi Qinghai and said seriously, "Lung cancer, advanced stage 3. Shi Qinghai's movements froze. He slowly removed the cigarette from his lips. He wanted to remove the cigarette from the mouth of the person beside him, but in the end, he didn't move. "You old dog, you're finally going to become a dead dog," Mr. Shi said with a smile, but there was a hint of sadness in his laughter. The intelligence network of the anti-government forces was like an ocean. He always thought that this boss, whose name he never knew, was a silver shark. Perhaps he would die bloody on a sharp hook, but he would never die of old age and quietly sink into the white sand at the bottom of the sea. How could such a legendary figure die for such a vulgar reason? He didn't want to believe this, but he had to. After a long silence, he asked in a hoarse voice, "Since you're going to die anyway, can you tell me your name?" "Oh, you can call me Shi Qinghai," the old man said seriously. A moment later, beside the dishwasher, the 2 men by the sewage started laughing at the same time. After leaving the balcony, Su Lu was quietly led to a remote room. In the room, he saw the quiet young woman standing in front of the oil painting, quietly admiring it. His mood suddenly calmed down. Someone who could influence the Ministry of Defense to order him to attend the banquet naturally wanted to see him. At this moment, this question was answered without asking, but Su Lu understood why Mrs. Zhong in the West Woods chose the Lufeng Slope Club and did it so secretly. "I know your question." Mrs. Zhong turned her head and smiled at Su Lu. "Last year, You gave me a difficult problem. Snatching someone under the nose of macho in the back of the mountain. It's not that easy. In an instant, a hint of pride appeared on the quiet young woman's face. Of course, in Bermuda and the West Woods, the Zhong family has the ability. The problem is that the entire Federation is under the indifferent gaze of Lady Tai. In Bermuda and the West Woods, the Zhong family can cover the sky with one hand, but in the capital, I can't do it. For the past few months, you've been asking me where the person is. In fact, he's always been in my hands, but I can't give him to you because I don't want that lady to find out that I'm involved in this matter. Mrs. Zhong looked at Su Lu with a grave expression and said, even if she may have already guessed, I don't want her to get the evidence. Chapter 356. When I finished updating the last chapter, I said that it was the best chapter of the day, and it was indeed so. A few days ago, I was looking at the things I wrote before. I always thought that this was the only way to improve. It could be considered a certain level of self-reflection. But in the end, I came to a conclusion that made me somewhat wrong. Starting from Ing Xiao, to the Vermilion Bird, to Qing Yunnian, to Spy, the first half was always just passable. No, it should be said that it gave me a headache. Of course, the later half would always be written much better. What I mean by better is compared to my own writing. For every story, I wrote better at the latter half than at the beginning. Every day, I wrote better at the latter half than at the beginning. Perhaps I didn't understand this before, but when I think about it carefully, it's a very normal thing. Because I'm a terrible person who needs to feel to write a story, I can't write smoothly if I don't get into the topic at the beginning. Every day, I have to get into the mood to write smoothly. When I feel good, I can really write 3,000 words per hour. Without a doubt, I even reached the peak of 3,600 words per hour. Of course, that required editing. And this kind of speed is like the climax of a story. It's always a flash of brilliance, and not a long-term happiness. I've been writing for 6 years, and there aren't many times when I feel like going crazy. Most of the time, I'm still like today's first chapter, writing 1,000 words per hour, suffering unbearably. Saying this makes it seem like I'm serious about writing, but in fact, my serious attitude towards writing can only be considered sloppy. It's far worse than many people. How many scenes are there that are unbearable to look at? Sometimes when I look back, I feel like my face is burning. Of course, there are also many scenes that are very cool. I'm very proud of myself when I look at them, but overall, I can barely maintain a level that's worth the 2 cents or 3 cents per 1,000 words that everyone spent on subscriptions. There's nothing to be proud of. Yesterday, when I saw Fire Beacon's chapter, I was very moved. I still insist that Ergo is the most awesome book this year. Whether or not it's pretentious or not, this book is the most awesome, and there's no other. In the past, I used to dislike top-class Gongzi the most, so sometimes I feel like this world is too strange. Damn, it's the same person, but why does his level increase so much? Is it that my eyes are dazzled? Therefore, this was the effect of the great killing weapon, seriousness. In the past, many people said that my writing was good, but I never responded. Now that I'm serious, it's all bullshit. Words have to be concise, elegant when they should be, crisp when they should be crisp. That's what makes good writing. How can an old woman's foot binding be any better? Of course, there were some good sentences in the foot binding cloth. It was just that I had a hard time picking them out myself. You should know that many of my friends have very wisely expressed their disgust towards those messy long sentences that pretend to be profound. I wholeheartedly agree, but a leopard cannot change its spots. A leopard cannot change its spots. Bah, I admit my mistake, but it will be difficult to change it in the next 2 years. Everyone, bear with it for now. The chapters in which I seriously believe my writing is good, and the ones in which I admit to having worked hard, are the ones that are concise. For example, there are a few chapters in Spy. There are also a few chapters that don't count as sour, and Fancian's first murder in the year of celebration. But not much, because it was easy to slip as one wrote. Slipping had its advantages, but there were more disadvantages. The problem was that when one did not slip, it would be very difficult to write. Of course, I was going crazy. How could it be of course? Of course, my favorite was still my nonsense. These few days were the transition chapters. They seemed peaceful and smooth, but in reality, they were written with a lot of heart. Furthermore, I updated 3 chapters in 3 consecutive days. I was very proud of my diligence. Thinking about it carefully, it was because I put pressure on myself and told myself to put more effort into it. The first half of Zhou Xingxing's Bastard was able to say such big nonsense, big truths, and big truths. As a storyteller, I have to remember this even more. When there is nothing else to do in life, my job is to make stories for everyone to read. So I have to put pressure on myself and put effort into it. When there is something to do, I write less. Presumably, you people who are used to my laziness would not bear to hit my face. Bear to? Even if you bear to, don't hit me. Although I'm not someone who relies on my face to make a living, there are still days when I have to welcome guests. I do not plan on unbanning this nonsense chapter like in the past. I will leave it until the end as a form of motivation and requirement for myself. I was indeed a little tired from writing the past 2 days. There was nothing about being unconventional or unconventional. I remember a book friend once said that he hated this sentence the most. Then, I desperately used this sentence in my nonsense. Am I especially bored? I shouted, please send me your monthly votes. Tomcat needs your votes. Bills, monthly votes, and recommendation votes. Bills are given if you subscribe. Monthly votes are given if you want to. Recommendation votes. I don't think you have the habit of giving me anything, right? Pounding the ground. I bowed and thanked you off the stage. I will sleep well and work hard to maintain my health. I will carefully write stories for everyone to enjoy. F***K. Just as I was preparing to update, I realized that I had exceeded it by another 1,000 words. In the future, if anyone dares to say that my writing is good, I will drag them down and beat them to death. Believe in Brother Chun. Continue. Chapter 357. 3 years ago, he had met this young woman at the airport. At that time, this lady had a gentle smile and kind eyes. Although she naturally showed a natural pride and nobility, because of a very insignificant matter, she had condescended to wait for him, who was wearing thin clothes, to give her a Westwoods military windbreaker and a small card. 3 years later, after only a few phone calls and then meeting again, the eyes that should have been unfamiliar became familiar because of that very enchanting sense of intimacy. So Sulu was a little touched. He had always thought that taking care of little watermelon on the spaceship escaping from Donglin was a small matter. It was not easy for the head of the West Woods Zhong family to treat a small person like him like this. This kind of kind attitude made him remember it to this day. His dark-colored Shilin military windbreaker had long since been riddled with holes during the assassination incident at Linhai Gymnasium. However, he had kept that incomparably old card, which in the end played the role of a great killing weapon. You mean, Lady Tai is still not willing to let go? Sula looked at Madame Zhong under the oil painting and asked, puzzled. Probably other than Lin Banshan and that little lunatic of the Leaf family, no one in the Federation knows what the old man and Lady Tai talked about that day in Lin Yuan. Madame Zhong sat on the sofa, her hands gently placed in front of her stomach. She looked at Su Lu with a smile and said, but this is a matter of face. Since you can come out of Qingchang safely, it means that Mo Cho has made concessions in front of the old man. You have the old man's face, so your safety won't be a big problem. Besides, Madame won't do this kind of thing. After all, with her status and tactics, it would be undignified for her to deal with you. Sulu understood why West Woods was so vigilant and even played a little trick of entering the tiger's den since Lady Tai wouldn't deal with him for the time being. But we, the West Woods, have interfered in this matter. Even if Lady Tai didn't do anything and just watched coldly from the sidelines, if she had the evidence and found out that the West Woods had spoiled her plans, it would mean that my husband and I owe her an explanation and a favor. We from the West Woods don't want to owe her a favor. Madame Zhong smiled slightly. Her smile seemed somewhat helpless as she said, the favor between the 7 great families is too great. We can't easily owe them. For the Zhong family in the West Woods, The annual budget review by the Parliament at the beginning of spring was the most troublesome thing. The West Woods region, which had been through many wars, required the Federation Management Committee to review the aid budget and energy quota. The tiger of the West Woods and his wife never cared about ordinary favors or explanations in society. However, Lady Tai, who lived in seclusion among the mountains and lakes, could influence many people in the Parliament with just a wave of her sleeves. For the Zhong family, this kind of favor was too big and a headache. Sulu understood this sentence and couldn't help but fall silent. He had only made a phone call to the Zhong family in the West Woods, whom he didn't know and had no relationship with, but they had helped him so much and caused so much trouble. He was in the middle of it, so even if he wanted to make up for it, it seemed that he couldn't do much. I owe you and Commander Zhong a big favor. He was not used to speaking in such a tone of authority in the Federation, but just like in the past, as long as he said something, he would definitely admit it. This was what it meant to be true to one's word. Madame Zhong had studied Su Li's file more than once, so she knew the true nature of this young man. She understood that although this sentence seemed normal, it actually carried some weight. She couldn't help but smile and say, "I don't think there's a chance for you to return this favor." Su Li's cheeks were slightly hot. He knew that Madame Zhong was not mocking him, but stating a fact. The only family in the Federation with military power among the 7,000 generations of the Federation's 7 great families might have some scruples in the capital ring, but in the West Woods, they were like local tyrants or separatist warlords. No matter what kind of trouble such a family encountered, they did not seem to need his help to solve it. If they encountered trouble that they could not solve, he would have no ability to help. "I'm very grateful for your willingness to help me, although I don't really understand the specific reason." He looked at Madame Zhong sincerely. Madame Zhong looked at him calmly. After a moment of silence, she replied, "Not all help has a hidden purpose. Although I'm very optimistic about your future in the army, before you went to assassinate Macklin, there was no such future and there was no need for investment. So, this is not an investment." Sula listened quietly. Madame Zhong smiled and sighed softly. Her amiable and warm face glowed faintly. She said slowly, "Many people are in awe of the old man behind you, although no one, including me, knows the real relationship between you and the old man. But even more people are afraid of your methods. I think that little old man from the Iron Calculator family would definitely not dare to face you alone, because the mentality you have shown is too dangerous." Sulu thought to himself in a self-deprecating manner. He was not a cold-blooded killer. But there are also many people who like you, such as the president. Madame Zhong smiled and said, "Including my tiger, so you don't have to feel any psychological pressure." Sulu thought of the things he had heard before. When President Pabre decided to pardon him, he had encountered countless resistance. But Commander Zhong, who had always been at odds with President Pabre in the West Woods, stood on the president's side and supported the pardon. Thinking of this, his gratitude to the Zhong family in the West Woods grew stronger. He did not know what to say, so he bowed seriously to express his gratitude. Fireworks and I are now living in Xixia State. The New Year's Eve holiday is coming soon. If you have time, you are welcome to be a guest, Madame Zhong said with a smile. Sulu was slightly stunned. The image of a little girl wearing a white dress and holding a doll bathed in the starlight naturally appeared in his mind. He had not seen her for 3 years. He did not know how the little girl who did not like to eat and liked to skip home had grown. The black car drove steadily and silently away from the Windy Slope Club like a ghost. This was a car specially made by the Tai family. The security personnel in the club already knew that this black car with a license plate had been given to a friend by the family's crown prince, so they did not check it carefully. Behind them, 2 dark green military vehicles were following them at a distance. Sulu narrowed his eyes and glanced through the rearview screen. He felt a little strange, but he did not order them to leave. After all, he was not sure if Lady Tai was willing to give up. With these brave experts following them, the safety of the 2 of them was more guaranteed. Nominally, it was a holiday, but after leaving the training base, the 7th Combat Group of Whitewater Company did not disband. Instead, they were divided into two groups and followed Su Lu closely, like special agents of a special task force to protect important people. Su Lu was not used to this arrangement. He thought, the 7th Combat Group is going to be Jian Shueyer's bodyguard soon. Why are these people protecting me? However, he understood that this should be an order from the Ministry of National Defense, or even the old man in Feiqing City. Even if he wanted to get rid of these people, it would be very difficult. In addition, during the training base and the exercise, he gradually got along well with more than a dozen men of the 7th Combat Group. Everyone deliberately avoided the knife he stabbed by Yulan at the wedding, so they were somewhat used to each other's existence. The black car drove past Hawking Avenue and went around to the second highway out of the city. Lan Xiaolong, who was in a military vehicle behind them, reported, "Everything is normal. No one is following us." Sula narrowed his eyes slightly. It seemed that Macho finally admitted the current situation. At this time, he did not need to worry that Lady Tai would find evidence of the involvement of the Zhong family in the Westwoods. Thinking of this, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. A trace of absolute joy appeared on his face, and he said, "I told you, who would care about small people like us?" Brother Wei, your courage has become too small. Those people in the military vehicle are all your men. They look like real soldiers. You are not a small person now. Accompanied by an unusually complicated voice, a pale and thin young man sat in the passenger seat. He looked at the radar system in front of him with a somewhat uneasy expression. He carefully touched the interior of the car, shook his head and sighed. "I haven't seen you for 3 years. It seems that you're doing well in the capital ring. Just now, the lady took me to the club. When I was at my best in the East Woods, I have never seen such a lively place." Su Lu turned his head and glanced at him. He found that his best friend had become a lot calmer than before because of the year in prison. Only the haggard and tired face that did not fit his age was still the same. 3 years ago, Li Wei was the leader of the orphan gang in the East Woods Region's Heshi district. Every night, he would fight for territory with the taser made by Su Lu with the other poor people. He would compete with the other poor people and yearn for those glamorous nightclub girls. 3 years ago, Su Lu was just an apprentice in a repair shop. Using the craftsmanship that his uncle taught him, he helped Li Wei make weapons that were suitable for him. At the same time, he patiently advised Li Wei to be careful, be kind to others, and not kill too many people. When the two of them met again 3 years later, many things had changed. The black car stopped next to a rice cake stall in the Wangdu district. After Su Lu and Li Wei got off the car, they walked to the stall and asked for some snacks. Then, they sat down at a small table on the sidewalk. 2 dark green military vehicles were parked not far away. The men of Group 7 did not get off the car. Instead, they vigilantly observed the surroundings. The 2 friends, who had not seen each other for a long time, met again. They did not know what to say to break the silence. After all, the 2 of them had experienced too many things, especially Su Lu. Li Wei looked at his ordinary face and the 2 military vehicles behind him with a complicated gaze. Although he did not know what Su Lu was doing, he could feel that Su Lu had put a lot of distance between them. Chapter 358. The autumn wind blew the fallen leaves on the street. It was already late at night, and the streets of Wangdu were unusually quiet and chilly. The dim light from the rice cake stall was particularly warm in such an atmosphere. The stall owner lowered his head and hid the meat skewers under a plastic sheet. He looked around cautiously, hoping that the HDD bureau wouldn't find trouble with him in such a cold and quiet night. There were 3 tables on the sidewalk, but only 2 customers. Not far away, there were 2 dark green military vehicles parked. The owner of the rice cake stall couldn't recognize the license plates of the 2 military vehicles, but he could guess that these 2 young customers must have some background. In this day and age, rich people who were used to eating exotic delicacies always liked to come to the streets to try something different. The middle-aged owner didn't find it strange, and he wasn't nervous. Even if the 2 young customers didn't order the black market mutton skewers that he treasured the most, he didn't secretly criticize the rich for being stingy. This was because he could see that these 2 young people were true friends. I don't think I'm that awesome. Maybe I'm just lucky. After escaping from Donglin, I somehow met some big shots. All right, I'm working in the army now, but my file should still be with Nutshell. Sulu lowered his head and nibbled on the spicy rice cake as he explained softly. His life was too strange, and there were many things that he couldn't explain to Li Wei. Moreover, the story of the past 3 years was too long. Even if he wanted to tell it, he didn't know where to start. Want a bottle of wine? Sulu asked for Li Wei's opinion. 3 years of hard liquor seemed to be the only way to fish out all the unnecessary worries of the young people. Li Wei nodded. He used his chopsticks to pick up a few pieces of roasted celery and put them into his mouth. He chewed with a poochy-poochy sound, as if there was a very heavy matter in his heart, and he didn't know where to start. Sulu filled the wine glass in front of him and himself, but didn't touch the chopsticks in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and stared at the celery and bean rolls covered in soy sauce on the plate. He seemed to be thinking about how to start the conversation, and he also seemed to have a heavy heart. They had finally reunited with their childhood friends who had not seen each other for a long time. Furthermore, there did not seem to be any danger around them in the Federation. They should have been shouting and hugging each other, but for some reason, it had become so strange. After a long silence, Li Wei picked up the glass of wine and gulped it down. He pursed his lips and asked, "After I was released from prison, I went to Fragrant Orchid Avenue to take a look. That repair shop had been converted into a protein meat distribution station. I thought you were dead, but last year I was brought back from Bermuda. That's when I found out that you were still alive. I want to ask you a question. Is the repair shop owner dead?" "Yes." Sulu slowly finished the wine in the cup and found that this transparent liquid was much more spicy than the amber liquor he usually drank. It stung his nose a little and made it difficult for him to breathe. He had great confidence in the uncle who had a carefree appearance but a cold heart. In the end, he was moved to tears by the uncle's death. After all, the uncle was the most wanted criminal in the Federation. How could he die so easily? However, 3 years had passed, and there was no news of the uncle at all. Coupled with the fact that he had witnessed the white beam of light from the battleship's main cannon, he could only gradually admit that someone had left forever in the depths of his heart. Li Wei's expression became more gloomy. Like Sulu, he had been living helplessly in the underworld. He had never had the opportunity to see the scenery of the upper class and taste the world of the big shots. Therefore, although he had some wisdom and perseverance, he still hadn't learned how to hide his emotions. "I have something to tell you." Almost at the same time, Sulu and Li Wei put down their glasses and said the same sentence. The two of them looked at each other. After being stunned for a while, Sulu spoke first. He looked at Li Wei's face and said seriously and apologetically, "Because of that taser, you were in prison for a year, and then you were kidnapped to Bermuda." He didn't finish his sentence because Li Wei was staring at him with a strange look. He scratched his head and couldn't help but smile bitterly. "What's wrong?" Sulu asked. Li Wei smiled bitterly and said, "Do you know what I want to say? I want to ask for your forgiveness. After all, that taser was stolen from my hands. It's all my fault that the government targeted the repair shop owner and put you on the wanted list. After I was released from prison, it was you who sent me that 1 million, right?" Li Wei looked at Su Li's face and said emotionally, "I was kidnapped by those big shots and taken to Bermuda. In the end, it was you who saved me, right?" "I've always felt sorry for you," Sulu murmured. Li Wei murmured, "I think so too." The heavy silence after the reunion was actually just because these two friends grew up together. They both felt a strong sense of guilt towards each other. This sense of guilt was intertwined between the two of them. Now that it was exposed, it blew a strong sense of warmth on this cold autumn night. The two of them looked at each other for a long time and then burst out laughing at the same time. It was just like many years ago on the sidewalk of the Clock Tower Street, watching the TV screen through the glass of the pub. Two orphans were holding their bellies and laughing at the plot of the family comedy that wasn't funny at all. Their eyes once lit up because of the cute little girl who played the role of the orphan. However, at that time, they weren't old enough and didn't have money to buy wine. Now it was different. "Boss, give us a few bottles of wine." Do you want those people in the car to come down and drink with us? Are those people really your subordinates? Who knows? Don't tell me. I still have a little bit of status in the army. 2 years ago, you sent me $1 million. Do you know what I used it for? I bribed Bao, a long Tao from the 2nd Division. It only took them 6 months to gather the troops and occupy 3 blocks. 3,000 kilometers away from the capital special district, the autumn atmosphere in the capital of Xixia State wasn't too strong. With his lieutenant colonel military ID, Su Lu took a free supersonic plane and arrived at this large state famous for its autumn red leaves. He took the address left by Mrs. Zhong and got into a taxi. Looking at the autumn trees outside the window that had just started to change color but didn't have time to turn red. Instead, they looked a little messy. He thought of many things from the past. The Federation's New Year's Autumn Festival had a long history. Whether it was to use lively parades to get rid of the desolation of autumn or to give housewives a chance to do some spring cleaning, no one could say for sure. Today, the place Su Lu was going to was in the suburbs of the state capital, so the taxi wasn't stopped by those parades. The reason why he specifically chose this day to accept Mrs. Zhong's invitation during a short vacation was because he owed her a huge favor. Also, he really missed that little girl. At the beginning of his life as a fugitive, he and that little girl could really be said to have depended on each other for survival. That kind of feeling was probably something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. In the past, Su Lu would never have any contact with the West Woods Zhong family. He had kept that card in his pocket for so long and never used it. Firstly, it was because the special forces under the West Woods Tiger, such as Colonel Lake, had seen his face before. If he were to come into contact with them, it was very likely that his true identity as a wanted criminal of the Federation would be exposed. Secondly, although it was a military order, Uncle Feng Yu had died under the main cannon of the West Woods battleship. As a student, even if he didn't avenge him, it was impossible for him to be close to the other party. But now, because of that old man and his strange relationship with the glory of the Charter, Su Lu no longer had to worry about his identity as a fugitive of the Federation. As for the uncle's death, after a night of drinking with Li Wei, he unknowingly became a lot calmer. Therefore, he left Li Wei's safety to the men of Group 7 and quietly got rid of them and came to Xixia. This was a large house in the suburbs. As a giant company of the Federation, the place where the chairman and daughter of the Guzhong Company lived was a little strange. The fact that the residence of the Group 7 was not a manor had already made Su Lu feel a little strange. A polite and respectful female housekeeper welcomed Su Lu into the first floor of the mansion. Su Lu saw Mrs. Zhong standing behind the door, and before she could say anything, she heard a deep, lazy, and even a little shameless voice. "Third young man is here." What kind of realm does a voice have to be able to make people hear shamelessness? Su Lu turned his head in shock and saw a fat, round face. This face had 2 slightly squinted eyes, looking harmless, but occasionally a cold light would pass through the narrow eyes, making people feel that this person was extremely dangerous. Su Lu had been kicked by this person before and had always remembered it in his heart. He deliberately imitated and learned, turning that fierce kick into his own killing technique. Naturally, he didn't forget the danger of this person. With a bitter face, he greeted, "Hello, Captain Tian." "Not good." Fatty Tian looked at him with incomparable pain and said, "You lied to me. That year on the ship, you refused to fight me with your real skills, making me think that you weren't a cultivation genius. Otherwise, I would have been the first person in the Federation to know about your relationship with the Li family." Su Lu only felt his whole body go numb and couldn't answer. Fortunately, Mrs. Zhong shouted, "Damn Fatty, don't make such a disgusting face. The fireworks are coming." Fatty Tian's whole body trembled, and he immediately straightened his chest and raised his head. With a solemn face, he actually put on the demeanor of a person like Du Shaoqing. Su Lu didn't have time to appreciate this fierce person's ability to change his face. He raised his head and looked towards the stairs, and at a glance, he saw the little girl jumping down. The little girl was wearing a white tutu dress, and her cute red little shoes made a crisp sound on the stairs. Her knee-length, light-colored socks and the light flower pinned on top of her head complemented each other beautifully, especially her black hair, which was extremely neatly cut back in the past. Her picturesque bangs followed her movements and mischievously swayed up and down. It really looked like a piece of watermelon skin. Of course, it was the very cute kind. At the villa's New Year's Eve festival, only the four of them ate. After seeing the little watermelon, Su Li's warm mood gradually became somewhat inexplicable as the silence at the dining table became silent. From the beginning until now, the 8-year-old Zhong Yanhua didn't even look at him directly. No matter how Mrs. Zhong smiled and talked about what happened on the ancient bell, the little girl still looked indifferent and proud. She was only willing to treat Su Lu at the dining table as a strange guest. After all, she was just a child. How could she remember the journey like an adult? He comforted himself, but he still felt a little lost in his heart. How could the reunion between Brother Su Lu and the little watermelon be so silent? Chapter 359. Huiyin, didn't you always say that you wanted to see Big Brother Su Lu? At the dining table, Mrs. Zhong looked at her daughter gently and said softly. She was very puzzled by her daughter's silence today. Although in these 2 years, she had rarely heard the words Big Brother Su Lu from her daughter's mouth. Even if it was just normal etiquette for entertaining guests, she shouldn't be so impolite. Yes. Zhong Huiyin held the long chopsticks in her small hands and worked hard to scoop up the fragrant rice in the bowl. Her cute and straight little nose made a sound, but she still didn't pay attention to the somewhat awkward Su Lu across the table. Mrs. Zhong looked helplessly at Su Lu and smiled apologetically. She had no choice but to let her daughter do as she pleased. After all, they were adults and wouldn't take this matter seriously, so she naturally changed the topic. When Fatty Tian ate, he had a delicate feeling that was completely opposite to his body shape. He chewed slowly, took gently, and put gently. His fingers gently brushed the tableware on the table, as if he was brushing orchids. He drank a mouthful of red wine and put down the wine glass. He smiled and patted Su Lu on the shoulder and said, I heard that you taught Du Xiaoqing a lesson, a military exercise. Su Lu wasn't used to the other party's direct enthusiasm, so he answered hesitantly. I mean on the field. When that kid was about to go crazy, you stopped him. Fatty Tian smiled and said loudly, Very good. I admire you very much. Su Lu was speechless. He thought that he had used his outburst to suppress Du Xiaoqing. Speaking of which, he had learned from the tiger in the West Woods. But it's a pity that you weren't direct enough. You should learn from me. More than 10 years ago, I directly beat this ice demon into an ice demon pig. Fatty Tian thought of the past and sighed with pride. When Su Lu heard the terms ice demon and pig demon and thought of Du Xiaoqing's solemn image as a role model military officer, he finally forgot about little watermelon's cold disregard that made him sad and almost laughed out loud. From the corner of his eyes, he glanced at the round hand on his shoulder, which was like a fat steamed bun, and the cute fat fingers like mutated orchids. His smile turned into a faint fear. If this Fatty Tian went crazy, that teacher Du would really suffer a lot. And the result? You were locked up in a small dark room for 3 months, and your military rank was suspended. When you retired, you could only be a colonel. Mrs. Zhong thought of the past and couldn't help but shake her head with a bitter smile. Her cheeks were stained with unnatural complex emotions. Listening to these heroic people's fierce deeds, Su Lu suddenly thought of the tiger in the West Woods that suppressed Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division for many years. Fatty Tian's actions back then might have had something to do with it. Everyone knew that the relationship between the Zhong family and Du Xiaoqing was extremely bad. He made Du Xiaoqing suffer in the maneuver. Could it be because of this that Commander Zhong in the West Woods had an inexplicable appreciation for him? Just as he was thinking about this, the middle-aged housekeeper who led Su Lu into the villa came over. At this time, the dishes had been served, so of course there was another reason for her appearance. Mrs. Zhong quietly listened to a few words, took off the napkin, stood up, and greeted Sulu. Then she walked into the attached office on the first floor. Today is the New Year's Day, so it's probably a call from the boss. Fatty Tian explained with a smile, but there was a flash of doubt between his eyebrows. If it was a family call, logically speaking, his sister-in-law should have brought Hui Yin along with her. Sulu couldn't think of this. In his opinion, Commander Zhong was guarding the front line for the Federation. Because of the continuous conflicts with the Empire, he couldn't reunite with his family. It was normal for him to call his family on this festive day. He just remembered that today was the New Year's Day, and it was very rare for Mrs. Zhong to invite him to be a guest. Who knew that not long after, the door of the side office opened, and Fatty Tian also left the dining room. It seemed that Commander Zhong had something to say to him. At this time, only Sulu and Zhong Huiyin were left in the dining room. If it had been before he entered the villa, Sulu would have resisted being alone with the little girl. He didn't hate or fear children. Besides, he was most familiar with the Zhong family in the West Woods, and the one he missed the most was Little Watermelon. The main reason for coming to the New Year's Day banquet today was to see her and ask her if she was doing well in the past few years, how her studies were going, and if she still didn't like to eat like before. However, the silent resistance during the meal and the undisguised indifference and pride on the face of the little daughter of the Zhong family made Sulu feel a little uncomfortable and sad. Although he could comfort himself that she was just a child after all, this huge gap between his self-perception and reality still made him feel awkward and lost. There was silence at the dining table. Sulu didn't know what to say to the little girl across the table. He felt a little funny and sad. In the absolute silence, it was as if he was sulking with an 8-year-old girl. So he had to lower his head and concentrate on the delicious food on his plate. He used a silver knife to cut the medium-rare wild beef, but he thought of 3 years ago on the ancient Bell spaceship. He had once boasted shamelessly to Little Watermelon that he would take her to eat real meat in the future. Suddenly, Sulu felt as if someone was looking at him. The mysterious power in his body had already made him sensitive to the aura around him. He slowly stopped moving the silver knife in his hand and raised his head vigilantly. Then he saw Zhong Huiyan's pair of clear eyes that were extremely serious. On that cute and delicate face, there was no longer the indifference that she deliberately put on just now. There was only the curiosity of a little girl and that pair of eyes that were getting bigger and bigger. Su Li's small eyes couldn't help but widen. He didn't know why Little Watermelon was looking at him like that. The two of them didn't speak. They just stared at each other inexplicably on both sides of the quiet dining table. It seemed that they would continue to stare like that. Suddenly, a trace of a child's cute and crafty look flashed in Zhong Huiyan's extremely clear eyes. It seemed that it took a very long time for the little girl to connect the young military officer across the table with the somewhat blurred but exceptionally friendly face from 3 years ago. Or perhaps she had already confirmed who the person across the table was and was just pretending. But in short, she was indifferent until now. Only then did the little girl smile sweetly and call out softly, "Brother Sulu." Her voice was very clear and crisp, like the dew on a little white flower that had just bloomed in the field, moistening the tender throat. This was a form of address that he hadn't heard for a long time. Accompanied by the clear and moving voice of a child, it touched Su Li's eardrums and also touched his heart. He looked at the little girl across the table in astonishment. He looked at her straight black hair that swayed gently, mischievously. It was as if he had returned to 3 years ago. In the simple cabin of a spaceship, he was still using a towel to wash this little girl's hair. His expression was dazed, and he didn't react for a moment. "Brother Sulu." Zhong Huiyan cutely wrinkled her brows and called out again very seriously. Sulu finally reacted, although he didn't understand why Little Watermelon was pretending to be a stranger to him. When he heard her call him brother twice, his prematurely aged heart immediately softened. He chuckled and narrowed his eyes into crescent moons, just like the 2 eyebrows in the night sky of S1. "Take me out of here." Zhong Huiyan looked at him seriously across the dining table. She pursed her lips hard, acting cute and determined. When the two of them met under the starlight, the little girl blurted out, "Protect me." Sulu stared blankly at the little girl across the table. He roughly understood why little Watermelon was so indifferent to him in front of Mrs. Zhong and Uncle Tian. She didn't have a trace of enthusiasm at all, as if she had completely forgotten what had happened in the past. Almighty Creator, 3 years had passed, and this child was already 8 years old. Could it be that she still hadn't gotten rid of the bad habit of leaving home? No matter how thick the nerves in Su Li's body were, it was difficult for him to resist this sudden impact. He was able to communicate with the glory of the charter. His brain, which had put down countless structural blueprints, buzzed and was about to explode. With a crisp bang, he simply fell under the table. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Zhong and Fatty Tian ended the call with Westwoods and walked out of the office with solemn expressions, just in time to see this scene. The elders came to the scene. Little Zhong Huiyin returned to her indifferent and proud expression. She gently scooped up the thick soup in front of her like a rude daughter of a rich family. Nothing. Sulu couldn't bear to expose little Watermelon's plan of leaving home and let her be scolded. But in fact, at this time, his mood was much better than before. At least he knew that little Watermelon hadn't forgotten about him, and she still trusted him as much as before. She even trusted him to handle such a big matter. Of course, Sulu wouldn't leave home with little Watermelon. He just quietly shook his head helplessly at the little girl when Mrs. Zhong wasn't paying attention. Then he left his private contact information on the internet. Zhong Huiyin sat on the sofa with a cold and listless face. After saying a few words to her mother, she went upstairs. But before she entered the house, she turned around and glared at Sulu. But the anger of a little girl was extremely cute no matter how one looked at it. When Mrs. Zhong sent Su Lu out of the door, she said a few words apologetically. After a moment of silence, she said, "I just received news that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have decided that Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division will enter the Westwoods." Sulu was shocked. Only now did he know the real content of the previous call. The taxi was parked on the side of the villa. Sulu declined Mrs. Zhong's offer in advance to send him to the villa. After saying goodbye, he sat in the passenger's seat. Thinking of little Watermelon's cute appearance at the dining table, Sulu couldn't help but smile bitterly. He couldn't understand why little Watermelon always wanted to leave her family at such a young age. Although Commander Zhong was rarely with his daughter, it was obvious that Mrs. Zhong was a very good mother. Maybe it was because she was lonely? Sulu looked at the mottled autumn leaves outside the window. He thought of Tai Ziyuan in H1 District and Zhouyu. The children of aristocratic families didn't have good lives. He thought that if he could come back alive from the front line in the future, he would spend more time with this child. At this moment, he heard some noise in the back seat. He looked back warily and saw that the chair in the back row had been pushed over. A little girl wearing a blue student uniform was crawling out with a face full of dust. Zhong Huiyin struggled to climb into the seat and sat down. She looked at Su Lu in front of her and giggled. She said, "Brother Su Lu, I'm here." Su Li's expression froze. His clear, childish voice sounded like thunder in his ears. Chapter 360. Sulu blinked his eyes with great difficulty to confirm that the little girl in the blue student uniform in the back was a real person and not an existence of his imagination. When he reacted immediately, he shouted to the driver next to him, "Stop the car. Go back." Hearing this, little Watermelon widened her big, innocent eyes and looked at her big brother, Su Lu, in confusion. She thought to herself, "Just now you insisted on not taking the family car and had the taxi wait downstairs. Wasn't it so that I could jump down from upstairs so that I could escape?" In the little girl's mind, she didn't run away from home alone, but had a perfect cooperation with brother Su Lu. When the little girl saw that Su Li's expression was serious and not lively, she finally understood that the car was about to turn back. She tightly hugged the somewhat old doll in her arms and screamed, "No!" With a sharp screech, the taxi abruptly stopped on the flat highway of Xixia State. The taxi driver, who had received a generous tip, stood in the woods beside the road and smoked a cigarette. He looked at the squirrel, who was busily preparing winter food, and occasionally whistled. Although he didn't understand the relationship between the young officer in the car and the little girl, he wasn't worried because the young officer didn't look like a shameless person who would abduct and sell a girl. Moreover, someone who could sit as a guest in that big house wouldn't lack this small amount of money. In the taxi, Su Lee's expression was calm and gentle, but his heart had already been shocked into countless turbulent waves. He painfully rubbed his hair and said to the little girl as calmly as possible, "Where did you get the idea that I would run away from home with you? You also thought that I called for this taxi specifically to cooperate with you?" Zhong Huiyin hugged the doll and looked at him with a cute frown. She said, "Isn't this always shown on TV?" Sula looked at her delicate face and the dust on her student uniform. His heart couldn't help but soften. Unable to say anything harsh, he took out his handkerchief and carefully wiped away the dust. Thinking that this little girl was actually able to climb down from the top floor of the villa, he couldn't help but feel a burst of fear. He asked, "I really don't know where you learned the ability to climb over walls at such a young age." Zhong Huiyin widened her eyes and looked at him doubtfully. She said softly, "Brother Su Lu, when we were young, you took me to drill the ventilation pipe on the spaceship. It was much more difficult than climbing down from upstairs." Hearing this, Su Lu was startled. His action of wiping her face froze, and a bitter smile appeared on his face. This little girl not only didn't forget the past, but even remembered these details so clearly. "But when you were young, are you an adult now?" Thinking of this, he gently rubbed the little girl's hair, just like how he used to do after washing her hair 3 years ago. Zhong Huiyin stubbornly broke her little head away from his palm and carefully smoothed her slightly messy black hair with the palms of her 2 small hands. Her action was very cute. Her lilac-like little mouth was tightly pursed to express her strong dissatisfaction with Su Lee's plan to send her home and her anger at the wrong person. In the 3 years since she came to the capital ring, Zhong Huiyin had been well-behaved and lovely. She lived a stable life with her mother and never ran away from home again. In the next 2 years, she even rarely mentioned the story of the past. Mentioning Brother Dongling's name was not because she was forgetful. Mrs. Zhong and the people in the villa had forgotten the past earlier than her because they thought that she was just a child. However, after the environment lost its vigilance, Zhong Huiyin was still quiet and well-behaved. She never tried to run away from home again because although she was young, she was absolutely smart and sensible. She knew that there were still many bad people in the outside world covered by the glory of the charter. The little girl did not have the courage to try anything until today, when Su Lu came, she finally saw the honest and loyal face that left the most vivid impression in her childhood. She found the most trustworthy brother Su Lu. Therefore, the chick found the courage and thought that she had a tacit understanding with Su Lu. She quietly changed her clothes, climbed downstairs, and got into the car. "You're wrong. Think about how sad your family will be if they can't find you." Su Lu was quick with action and not taciturn with words. However, in front of a stubborn and sad little girl, he did not have the ability to play the role of a mature elder at such a young age. He could only say the boring words of those boring teachers in movies, TV shows, and novels. He spoke carefully. Zhong Huiyin did not reply. The little girl lowered her head slightly and maintained absolute silence. The black hair by her face covered her ears. The clear bangs in front of her forehead just happened to reach her eyebrows. She was using this kind of silent resistance to stubbornness and futility. "I'll come to play with you often in the future, okay?" Su Lu made a promise that even he himself did not believe. This was probably a rare time for him to lie. He was about to lead Team 7 to carry out the security advisory work. Who knew what the federal military was thinking behind the incident of protecting the national idol? Before the situation in the West Woods calmed down, he simply had no time to come to Xixia State again. Zhong Huiyin suddenly raised her head. Her tuft of hair swayed and then fell down peacefully. It was like a little blackbird spreading its wings and testing to fly once. "You're lying again." The little girl opened her eyes wide. Her bright eyes, like a shallow lake, were filled with unconcealed childlike grief and anger. She said quickly and angrily in a thin voice. 3 years ago, you said you would take me out to play. What did you come? Sulu was stunned. He did not know how to explain. Could he say that he was a wanted criminal of the Federation and that someone under her father knew him? Or could he tell this little girl, who was still so clean that it made one's heart ache, about his 3 years of experience? For example, how he used a pen to stab an old man's skull, how he kicked a mecha, how his bones were shattered, and the endless darkness. He took out his phone. As he began to press the button, he laughed bitterly and said in a low voice, I really don't understand you, little girl. The little miss of the West Woods Zhong family. You don't know how many people are envious of you, but in the end, at such a young age, you always want to run outside. The outside world is actually not that fun. I'm not going out to play. Zhongyan opened her eyes wide and stared angrily at Su Li's fingers that were pulling out the phone. Her little hand that was holding the old doll tightly clenched. She quickly said in a shrill voice, I just want to go out and take a look. Can't I do that? How is that something an 8-year-old child would say? Su Lu said softly. Hearing the chirping sound coming from the phone, he shook his head. What's there to see outside? Even if you're determined to be a traveler, you can't go wandering around the world at such a young age. I'll be 9 next month. I'm not a child. Zhong Huiyan looked at Su Lu with disdain. Her dark eyes rolled up, making her look exceptionally smart. I'm locked behind a metal door every day when I go to school. After class, I'm picked up by Annie Chiu and those bodyguards. I've never gone out to play with my classmates. I don't even know where my desk mate lives. They invited me to a birthday party, but my mother didn't agree. Last time, my mother finally found a day to accompany me to the amusement park. In the end, there was no one in the amusement park. There was only a Ferris wheel and a wooden horse spinning. She thought that I didn't know anything. How could I not know? The amusement park was closed that day, and it was opened especially for me. What's the point of a one-person amusement park? I'm alone in dance class, piano class, and even baking pie class. I'm alone. Unlike other children, Zhong Huiyan didn't use an aggrieved voice to beg Su Lu to take her away. Instead, like a little adult, she stared seriously and angrily at Su Li's eyes. The words coming out of her small mouth became faster and faster, and her voice became softer and softer. It was almost condensed into a straight line. If a woman spoke in such an angry and exaggerated tone, it would inevitably seem a little neurotic. But when a cute little girl said this, it could only show her cute stubbornness and unwillingness. In the life of a little missy, Zhong Huiyan's curiosity about the outside world grew stronger day by day, but she was increasingly unable to interact with the outside world in a normal way. In everyone's opinion, the little missy of the Zhong family had everything, but little Watermelon didn't think so. She couldn't understand all of this logically, but she could clearly feel from life that if only one person could have everything, it was actually equivalent to having nothing. Mrs. Zhong, yes, she's with me now. I'll send her back right away, Su Lu explained into the phone. I don't know either. She suddenly came out of the back seat just now. Well, okay, it's okay. Mrs. Zhong had just found out that her daughter was missing. Before she had time to start worrying, she received a call from Su Lu. After she relaxed, she couldn't help but feel a little funny. Why did the little girl, who is usually well-behaved and quiet, trust Su Lu so much every time she saw him? Su Lu was on the phone with the villa while watching the little girl's movements from the corner of his eye. After Zhong Huiyan vented her anger and unwillingness, she didn't speak again. She turned her head and looked out of the car window in silence. Her small face reflected in the car window looked very disappointed. Was she alone? Mrs. Zhong's voice on the phone gradually faded. Sula looked at the little girl's slightly lonely back and remembered what Tai Ziyuan had said to him in the gymnasium. At that time, Lady Tai had tried to let Tai Ziyuan grow up normally in a commoner school. However, with the sudden assassination, this method of education had come to an end. Among the 7 big families in the Federation, the Tai family and the West Woods Zhong family only had one person in this generation. Loneliness was one thing, but the danger they were about to face was another. Sulu understood very well why Mrs. Zhong was so cautious, but looking at Zhong Huiyan's small shoulders, he couldn't help but feel a little emotional about her unusual teenage years. At this moment, it suddenly started to rain in Shisha State. The round raindrops hit the glass window of the taxi and scattered into small umbrellas. The quiet Zhong Huiyin gradually opened her eyes wide and smiled as she watched the changes in the raindrops. Seeing the little girl's expression, Su Li's big heart suddenly softened. After a moment of hesitation, he said very embarrassedly into the phone, "Madam, can I take Huiyin out to play for 2 days?" The little girl obviously heard this sentence, but she still didn't turn around. She just looked at the rain on the glass window, and her eyes gradually curved up, looking very cute. Chapter 361. The rain didn't stop, and the cold wind was blowing. Especially on the tarmac of the capital's Jiao airport, the autumn wind and rain were even more depressing. The cold wind and rain poured into people's sleeves, instantly cooling people's eagerness to return home. The passengers sitting on the self-transit express train looked at the two figures walking on the tarmac, one big and one small. They wondered if they wanted to walk back to the building in such cold weather. At first, the passengers thought that they were a father and a daughter, but when they saw the young face of the officer, they had to overturn this conclusion. They couldn't help but feel very strange. The cold autumn rain didn't stop, and the cold wind blew horizontally. In the wind and rain, Su Lu held the big black umbrella in his left hand and held the little daughter of the Zhong family's hand in his right hand. They walked to the side of the tarmac. Because he was worried that the little girl would get wet, he leaned most of the umbrella to the right. The left side of his body was already wet, and the dark green military uniform looked like it was painted with ink. The little girl's left hand tightly held his hand, and her right hand was holding the old doll. She silently followed Su Lu and walked forward quickly. Although it was hard, she didn't say anything. Her beautiful long eyelashes fluttered, and her eyes were smiling like crescent moons. Her white socks and black shoes under her little blue dress were running quickly in the shallow pool of water. Only then did she have time to keep up with Su Li's speed. With her broken and laborious footsteps, the little school bag she brought from home jumped up and down, and the neat black hair on the top of her head also jumped up and down. It was just like the child's mood at this time. Sula finally reacted and slowed down. At the same time, he tilted the black umbrella in her direction. The two of them didn't talk much along the way. They just walked in silence like this. There was a tacit understanding and a wonderful sense of rhythm, just like 3 years ago in the 32nd district of the spaceship. They didn't walk far before Major Lon Xiaolong came down from the black car and welcomed the two of them to the car. He sat in the dark green military vehicle behind them. It was very warm in the black car, and it was completely isolated from the cold rain and autumn wind outside. Su Lu took out a towel and warmed it in front of the heater. He then covered Zhong Huashan's little head and rubbed it casually. He wanted to explain the military vehicle behind them and the identity of the men in Group 7. But looking at the little girl's eyes, she didn't seem to be very interested in these things. That's right. Every time the little miss of the Zhong family went out, she would be followed by a group of Special Forces soldiers. A formation like this, to her, was very common. The school bag and the old doll lay quietly in the back seat. Su Lu quietly dried little Watermelon's wet hair, but his mind was thinking about something else. A bitter smile appeared on his lips. He didn't know if it was because he was obsessed or because he was shattered by the little girl's expression when she looked at the raindrops outside the window, but he unexpectedly asked Mrs. Zhong on the other end of the phone to take her out for 2 days. What was even more inexplicable was that Mrs. Zhong actually agreed to this absurd and irresponsible request after some consideration. It was important to know that little Watermelon was the only heir of the Zhong family in the West Woods. She had always been under extremely strict care in the capital ring. How could Mrs. Zhong agree to let her leave with Su Lu? Are you satisfied now? Su Lu threw the white towel in the back seat and looked at the little girl helplessly. Zhong Huiyin's ink-black eyes looked up, as if she was thinking. Then she nodded vigorously, and the word yes came out of her straight and cute little nose. She rubbed her hair vigorously and shook it around with a giggle. She was like a puppy that had just returned home from a rainy day. She was extremely cute. Downstairs at Wangdu Apartments, Sulu carefully instructed the people in the military vehicle, mainly Lan Xiaolong. He wasn't used to the men from Group 7 following him around like bodyguards every day, but today, he was bringing little Watermelon home. It was the first time the little miss of the Zhong family had left her parents' protection to go out and play. If he didn't have such a security expert by her side, he wouldn't be able to rest assured. Even if Mrs. Zhong said on the phone that the security forces to protect the little girl would follow them to the capital. "Call Uncle Li," Sulu said to Zhong Huiyan as he pushed open the door of the apartment and pointed at Li Wei on the sofa. Zhong Huiyan glanced at the man on the sofa, nodded, and called, "Uncle Li." There wasn't much respect or intimacy in this call of uncle. The little girl's delicate and pretty face had a faint pride and indifference that kept people thousands of miles away. She didn't have the kind of intimacy that Mrs. Zhong had hidden deep in her heart, but she had learned her external expression perfectly. Although she was young, she already had a bit of a noble aura. Li Wei was sitting on the sofa and watching television in boredom. He had a cigarette in his mouth and a wine glass in his hand, looking like a gangster or scum. Suddenly, he saw Su Lu bring home a little girl carved out of ice and jade. He was shocked and quickly brushed away the cigarette ash on his body and asked, "Whose child is this?" "She's really pretty." Su Lu let out a wry laugh. He couldn't possibly tell the truth that this was the little princess of the West Forest region. He shook his head and sighed. "The child of a friend in Xixiao wanted to come to the capital to play, so I brought her back." "That's good. This is also my first time in the capital as a country bumpkin. I wanted to ask you to accompany me for a stroll, but I was afraid that you would be busy. Coincidentally, I'm with this little girl." Li Wei suddenly stopped talking because he saw the indifference on this little girl's face. He sensed that she was definitely not a country bumpkin. Zhong Huiyan didn't do what Su Lu thought she would do, run around the various rooms curiously, admiring the simple yet genuine happiness of the lower class of society. Then, she would become intoxicated by it and jump on the sofa while laughing. That was something that little girls in television dramas would do. It was obvious that this little girl didn't have such a boring hobby. She just quietly walked around the living room with a trace of caution and curiosity in her eyes. The little girl's gaze fell on a stack of miniature discs under the television screen. She curiously looked at the discs that looked like coins. She lowered her little head and seriously studied them for a long time. Suddenly, she raised her head and looked at Su Lu and Li Wei. She said in an incomparably serious tone, "This is a pirated version." Su Lu and Li Wei looked at each other and felt endless shame and embarrassment. When they were young, they were orphans in Donglin. Naturally, they had developed the bad habit of buying cheap pirated versions. Now that they were being sternly criticized by an 8 or 9-year-old little girl, they couldn't help but feel their faces heat up. Who knew that Zhong Huiyan would suddenly burst out laughing? The little girl excitedly shrieked, "That's great! I've always heard people say pirated versions, but I've never seen them even once." She hugged the stack of pirated discs and turned around. She said, "Brother Su Lu, I've never seen pirated versions. The Federation TV station doesn't make my favorite all-metal Frenzy discs, so I can only watch replays every time. But that station has too many advertisements." She innocently looked at Su Lu and asked in an incomparably serious tone, "I've heard that pirated versions don't have advertisements. Is that true?" Su Lu opened his mouth wide. After a long time, he cautiously said, "Why don't you take a look at this legendary pirated version?" Little Zhong Huiyan stubbornly and sorrowfully uttered a series of words that broke Su Lu Ro's heart. His fatherly love grew in him, and he resolutely brought Zhong Huiyan back to his home. He had thought that after leaving the villa, the little girl would scream in excitement, cut up the bed sheets, and pretend to be a witch to scare people. She would go to the amusement park overnight to play with heartbeats, go to the fast food restaurant to eat junk food, and play games crazily. He had even mentally prepared himself to accompany her to ride the Snow Mountain Dragon. The Snow Mountain Dragon was the longest and most thrilling roller coaster in the universe. However, he had never thought that little girl Zhonghuan would just sit quietly on the sofa with a plate of freshly fried potato sticks in her hand. She was obediently watching the TV series on the hologram. No, to be precise, she was watching pirated discs. Whose child is this? She hasn't even seen pirated versions before. Isn't she too pitiful? Li Wei looked at Sulu, who was tidying up the kitchen, and sighed with emotion. Sulu didn't dare to look at the little girl in the living room. In fact, he was already dumbfounded. He thought that the upbringing of the 7 great families was too serious. Back then, it was acceptable that Tai Ziwan had never eaten scallion pancakes, but he had never seen pirated versions. He had the urge to call the young master and ask if he had ever watched porn before Miss by Chi took his virginity. The early autumn festival was only a few days away. Sulu really wanted to make little Watermelon happy, so he naturally couldn't let her stay at home and watch pirated versions every day. After thinking about it, he couldn't think of where to take the little girl to play. Suddenly, he remembered that among his few friends, the woman in red in the Shishan courtyard was already a mother, so he directly dialed a number. Drag that Dalmatian back and kill him as soon as possible before I call the guards to shoot him. As soon as the call went through, Zhou Yu's voice was extremely cold and angry. It directly made Su Li's ears go numb. He held the phone in shock and took 2 seconds to understand. Dalmatian. She must be talking about that playboy Mr. Sure. He hadn't been seen for more than a day. Could it be that he had run to the Shishan courtyard? Shishan courtyard? An anti-government spy had run to the entrance of the Federal Army's most heavily guarded courtyard. Although the Federation was playing a big game of reconciliation, wasn't sure Qinghai's approach a little too fierce. What's the meaning of him blocking the entrance of the courtyard? He's even calling the Sentinels brothers, putting his arm around their shoulders, and exhaling smoke. Sulu, I'm warning you, before those generals come in and out, and before my father comes back, you'd better drag him away and bury him as soon as possible. Otherwise, even if I don't shoot him, there are plenty of people who will. Zhou Yu's voice on the phone was unusually cold, just like the girl in red in front of the nightclub in Linhai. However, Sulu could only hold the phone and frown bitterly, thinking that it was useless for him to persuade that young master. He hesitated and said, "He probably wants to see you or the child. What are you afraid of?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. From the corner of his eye, Su Lu saw the little girl in the living room yawning, but still staring at the TV screen. He hurriedly told her about the troubles of a certain daughter. Unexpectedly, the daughter of the Zhou family was stunned and simply said, "Get out. The following doesn't count." This chapter is much more interesting. When I was writing the first chapter, I was listening to Yang Naiwen. In the end, I still couldn't write well because my mood was a bit messy and I was too short on time. During the day, I was busy with work and other chores like buying tickets. Actually, everyone should be able to see that I've been in a really good state these past few days. I'm sorry to inform everyone that I can't maintain this state any longer because tomorrow I'll be leaving Daqing and embarking on a journey. The leader's father, who is also my most respected elder, is hospitalized in Baotou, Inner Mongolia. The 2 of us will be going to visit him tomorrow and probably won't be back until next Saturday. However, the news we've received is good, so there shouldn't be any major problems. We just don't know how long he'll need to recuperate. I hope he recovers soon. In fact, I've been waiting for her to ask for leave so that she can leave, so I've been working hard these past few days to write more. However, I didn't expect that she'd just change to a new unit and leave so suddenly that I didn't have a single chapter saved. In the next few days on the road and in Baotou, I tried my best to make time to write. I've been writing intermittently until today. Ever since I promised to keep updating, I haven't stopped. I'm trying to keep it up, but the most I can write every day is 3,000 words. Perhaps one day I'll reach 2,000 words. Perhaps I'll really stop updating. Chapter 362. Su Lu was very experienced in taking care of pregnant women. It was not difficult for him to take care of children with his meticulous mind. It was just that when he was on the spaceship, he lived with the little girl in the small cabin and told her a few fairy tales every night. Now that little watermelon was almost 9 years old. Her delicate features had not yet shown the temperament of a young girl, but it could be seen that she would not have much interest in fairy tales anymore. It's really troublesome. Sulu felt that his vacation might be the last one in his life, and it had been messed up by many things. The bad taste of life was vividly reflected in these few days, starting from Mr. Sure to Li Wei, and then to Little Watermelon. All the people he had not seen for a long time rushed back into his life. Although it was infinitely warm, it was also infinitely busy. What had Wangdu apartment ever been so lively? The most troublesome was still Little Watermelon. He leaned against the kitchen door with a cup of coffee in his hand and looked at the little girl on the sofa, who could barely lift her eyes. He couldn't help but smile slightly. He didn't know why this little girl always had absolute trust in him. 3 years ago, she was not even 6 years old. After 3 years, how could she still remember him? This kind of trust and the feeling of being remembered was very warm. Sulu forgot which philosopher had said that being needed was a very deep kind of happiness. But at the same time, this kind of trust and being needed was also a kind of great pressure. In addition to the pressure of Mrs. Zhong's trust in him for no reason, it was like a sharp knife under the soles of his feet. He had to be careful with every step he took. He had to let Little Watermelon have a happy vacation and ensure her absolute safety. After being told to get lost by Zhou, he knew that the young mother was extremely angry because of the spotted dog at the gate of the Westwoods compound. Naturally, he didn't dare to call again. After thinking about it, he had to let Little Watermelon have fun, and it had to be safe and quiet without any danger or disturbance. He really didn't know where to go in the upper class of the Federation, except for Linyuan and Lufeng Slope. But how could those places be suitable for a little girl? He suddenly remembered that he had received a call from Li Xiaotong yesterday. Li Xiaotong looked cold, but in fact, he was quite a good person to befriend. He was a good person to consult, and anyway, he had to meet him before the end of his vacation. A place to play? No problem. The 3D movie washes the holographic screen. The amusement facilities are all there. Seventh young master Li's faint voice came from the phone. That's good. It's clean, right? How can the place we play be unclean? Li Qishao reprimanded somewhat angrily. Sulu added seriously, it's for little girls to play with. Li Xiaodong paused for a moment before replying, don't worry. No problem. Under the archaic eaves of the ivy garden, Li Xiaodong put down the phone. In his calm eyes, the usual gloominess had faded a lot, but there were more complicated emotions. He muttered to himself, how young is a little girl? Brother Zeng still stood at the door like a gun tied in a coarse cloth. He knew very well that the young master wasn't asking him a question, but he still took 2 steps forward and prepared to arrange tomorrow's meeting. We won't do anything illegal. We won't touch anyone under the age of 14. Li Qishao instructed. He frowned slightly and said hesitantly, something's not right. Why did Su Lu become such a beast all of a sudden? The arranged place was a theme park. As for what the theme was, Su Lu drove the black car all the way along the cliff to the mountainside, looking at the Ferris wheel and the iron tower near the sea, but he still couldn't figure it out. Beside him, Zhong Huiyan rubbed her slightly dry eyes. She was quite interested in the scenery in the southern suburbs of the capital. After all, she was a little girl. Looking at the mountains full of autumn sunflowers outside the theme park, she was somewhat happy. Li Wei was dozing off in the back seat, but young master sure didn't follow them. He was sleeping in the Wangdu apartment. This beautiful flower waiter had spent the entire night blocking the entrance of the Shishan compound. He was already extremely tired and naturally didn't want to join this strange group of 3 men bringing a little girl to the amusement park. According to the radar map mark given by Li Qishao, Su Lu drove the black car around the mountainside road. Suddenly, there was a wide open space in front of him. The lively amusement park was temporarily left behind. In front of him, there was a layer of fog on the mountainside opposite him. In the fog, he could vaguely see a manor. Behind the manor, there was a large area of slightly undulating green grass between the autumn hills. Building a golf course in the middle of the valley, this manor was really amazing. What surprised the three people in the car even more was that on the cliff to the right of the manor, there was a line shining with a metallic luster. Looking at it carefully, they found that it was an open-air elevator more than a kilometer long. Looking at the direction, it directly led to the large amusement park in front of them. This kind of design momentum couldn't be called big, but it should be called incomparably luxurious. After verifying the citizen information at the entrance of the manor, a staff member in a black suit bowed his head respectfully and got on the electric scooter in front to lead the way for the black scooter and the dark green military vehicle behind. After traveling for a short while in the slightly foggy valley, they passed through two deliberately arranged stone gates and arrived at their destination. After getting off the car, Su Lu held Zhong Huiyin's little hand and walked straight ahead. Li Wei turned up his collar and followed behind the two. With a cigarette in his mouth, he looked at the furnishings in the manor with a complicated expression. He was shocked by the noble atmosphere here and was a little speechless. The staff member led the group to a door and left. Su Lu looked at the intoxicating wood door in front of him and thought that this door alone was probably worth a year of his salary. Although he knew that Li Xiaodong and Little Watermelon were qualified enough to enjoy this kind of extravagance, and he had been in many high-end places in the past few years, he still couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. The moment the intoxicating wood door was pushed open, there was a sudden burst of crackling sounds in the room. Su Lu narrowed his eyes, and his pupils shrank and then dispersed. In an instant, he knew that he hadn't been ambushed. These crackling sounds weren't gunshots, but small fireworks in the room. Because of the countless shredded paper shimmering with rainbow colors under the light, it was like a fairy scattering flowers. Among the scattered paper fireworks, there was a neat sound in the originally quiet room. 8 beautiful girls with beautiful eyebrows and picturesque eyebrows bowed deeply to Su Lu, who had pushed open the intoxicating wood door. They smiled and said, "Hello, Brother Su Lu." What made people's eyes feel as if they had just been washed by water was their cute and seductive outfits. The light yellow miniskirts were close-fitting, showing off the curves of the young girls who were already tall and straight, but still slightly young. The close-fitting yellow miniskirts were so short that it couldn't be any shorter. There was even a small slit on both sides, showing off the legs that were full of youthful elasticity and vitality. They were as white as the tender core of a willow tree after being peeled off its bark. The 8 girls were all first-year students of the Federation's Academy of Arts. The oldest was only 16 years old. They had not been tainted by too much worldly dust and were attracted to this place by the irresistible money and future. They had a trace of pure and decadent aura that was hard to resist. Yellow, tender, energetic, pure. All of these were gathered on these 8 girls, but it was all for the sake of highlighting the word tender, coupled with the phrase Big Brother Su Lu that was deliberately trained. If it was any other man who saw this scene, he would probably feel a wave of youthfulness rushing towards him, and his mind would sway and be unable to control himself. The 7th young master of the Li family was sitting on the sofa, smiling as he looked at the door. He thought to himself, "Mugu's arrangements are indeed beautiful. Su Lu, no matter how strange your request is, I'm sure you'll be satisfied with this formation." Li Wei was very satisfied. He stood behind Su Lu with his mouth wide open, completely speechless. He thought to himself, isn't Su Lu doing too well now? He's actually playing the drama of finding his first love? You should know that we didn't properly go to school when we were young. Could it be that you had a crush on someone back then? Su Lu looked at the 8 girls who were smiling sweetly like lotuses in a river. His heart had long been in a mess. He vaguely understood that there was a problem with the communication between him and Li Qixiao. While he was shocked, he remembered that Little Watermelon was still behind him. If this little girl saw this scene, no matter how naive she would be able to roughly understand what was going on. With this thought in mind, the 8 delicate lotuses in front of him suddenly turned into a thicket of more than 3,000 sharp blades, stabbing under his butt, causing him to be in so much pain that he wished he was dead. Little Zhong Yanhua felt the strangeness in front of her and curiously poked her head out from behind Su Li's back. Su Li's reaction was surprisingly fast. He quickly displayed the 10 postures that the uncle had taught him. His right hand moved horizontally to the right as if it was splitting a mountain, firmly blocking the little girl's face. Just as he was about to give Li Xiaotong a wink, the little girl beside him exclaimed in surprise and admiration. "Cool." The little girl, Zhong Yanhua, stood on tiptoe, her pair of lively black eyes staring at the edge of Su Li's palm. Her eyes were wide open as she looked at the lotus-shaped girls not far in front of her. After clearing the place, Su Li had to admit that the club arranged by Li Xiaotong was indeed clean and fun. It was not a place specially used for that kind of shady business. Going down the open-air elevator on the cliff, there were countless things suitable for little girls to play with. But in the end, he lost face in front of Little Watermelon. Every time he thought of the 8 lotus-shaped girls calling Su Lu brother in unison, and then thought of Little Watermelon's exclamation of "cool," he felt his face become a little hot. "Can't you make it clear on the phone?" Li Qixiao stared at him with a gloomy face. Su Lu angrily retorted, "How did I not make it clear? It's just that you perverted children of aristocratic families always have such complicated thoughts. Look at those little girls you found. I'm afraid some of them have just turned 14. Li Xiaodong cut off the seal of the coarse tobacco and handed 2 sticks to him and Li Wei beside him. "Don't mention this. Fortunately, Wood Valley is really clean and no outsiders come here. Usually, only a few family members who are familiar with each other come here for a holiday." He did not know Li Wei, but from the way Li Wei held the tobacco and some details, he could tell that this young man should belong to the lowest group of people in society. But he also knew that Su Lu did not have many friends in the Federation. For this person called Li Wei to be introduced as a friend by Su Lu in such a serious manner, he naturally could not be underestimated. Wood Valley? After coming in, I keep feeling that the style here is somewhat familiar. Su Lu raised his head and glanced at the elegant furnishings in the room, squinting his eyes as he tried to distinguish the authenticity of the paintings. Chapter 363. Wood Valley is the property of the Lin family. After Lin Banshan broke the door, he no longer cared about the family's affairs. Of course, the old men of the previous generation of the Lin family were unwilling to give up. They begged and pestered people to enter the Lin Garden. They shamelessly learned from the Lin Garden and built such a place. Li Xiaotong rubbed the thick tobacco with 2 fingers and lowered his head. This garden not only imitated the form, but also the spirit. Plus, the special administrative region government built a large entertainment area on the other side of the mountain, so it's very suitable for a family vacation. It's said that President Sieg liked it very much when he came for a summer vacation 2 years ago. Unfortunately, this mountain is not as good as the White Mountain behind Linyuan. Also, there's no airport, so it's not very convenient. Fortunately, there's a lot of clouds in the mountain, which makes up for some of the disadvantages. Sula took a sip of red wine and pursed his lips. During high-class occasions in the capital ring, the place he went the most was Linyuan. He often sat by the flowing water of the bamboo residence. He had a deep impression of the White Mountain under the curtain of night and the private jet taking off and landing from time to time. That was the first impact of the Federation's wealth on his heart. Now that he heard Li Xiaodong's words and thought of the noble aura he saw when he entered the manor, he thought that it was no wonder. Li Wei did not know Li Xiaodong. He only knew that this gloomy young master was probably a big shot, but he could not imagine that this person was one of the 7 legendary family's heirs. He held the thick tobacco clumsily and lowered his head to listen to the conversation between Su Lu and Li Qixiao. The two talked about the president, the private airport, and other unfamiliar terms, which made him even more silent. He did not want to do anything inappropriate or say anything ridiculous. He could only enter the manor as Su Li's friend, so he did not want to lose face for Su Lu. It had been some time since he crashed into the top circle of the Federation, but Su Lu still had not figured out the brand or the so-called foundation of the coarse tobacco and red wine. As for the year, the rainwater, the pH of the soil, and the complicated relationship between the taste and taste, he was even more confused. Perhaps it would have been easier for him to recite and evaluate the paintings and paintings in the room according to the Dictionary of Art Evaluation in the library. However, this did not affect him from taking a puff of tobacco and a sip of red wine. When it came to enjoyment, perhaps one could enjoy it at a higher level by knowing the reason. However, that was all he could do to at least satisfy the physiological feelings of his senses. Placing the coarse tobacco on a large ashtray made of red-brown rice stone, Sulu at least learned not to flick the ash. After a moment of silence, he said to Li Xiaotong, "Both the Li family and the Lin family want me dead, but because of you, maybe the Li family can tolerate me." The Lin family. I've beaten up Lin Daohai and trampled over Lin Yuanhu. It feels weird to be a guest at their property. This is an open business. A family like the one we grew up in will never solve all the grudges on the surface. Li Xiaotong said faintly. Everyone has to abide by the rules. Although Lin Daohai is brave and fierce, it's impossible for him to use an automatic rifle to sweep you away. In this world, other than you and Lin Banshan, who would do such a thing? Sulu heard the hidden meaning in this sentence and smiled. Coincidentally, I only found out when I came. Lin Daohai and the leader's son who was beaten up by you at the banquet are also here. However, I don't think the two of them dare to disturb your mood. Li Xiaotong raised the wine glass in his hand and said with a smile, "How many people in the Federation dare to mess with you now? You made me sound like a playboy, right? I didn't expect you to bring a little friend here. I was going to introduce some people to you today." Li Xiaotong put down the wine glass and said, "Of course, they're all people with ulterior motives. They have some power in the S1 states. Apart from a few people who are interested in the little money I have on hand, the others are only here to make early investments. You can understand from this point alone that they are not really powerful people. At most, they are second-tier people." Sulu understood. Even if Li Qixiao was the second successor of the Li family in name, as long as that beautiful Li Xiuzhu was still alive and didn't make the decisive mistake of the last presidential election, he would always be at a disadvantage in the competition. Your money is not a little money. Perhaps it was because of Su Li's sudden appearance that the old men of the Li family, who had always been calculating, discovered for the first time that the Li family's seventh brother had a vision for investment. In just a dozen months, the private investment fund that he could control had risen to 970 million yuan. This amount of money could be considered a great fortune anywhere in the Federation. However, in the eyes of people like Li Xiaotong, compared to the vast wealth of his family, it was naturally just a little money. "I don't have much interest in those investments. I'm going to keep all this money for you." Li Xiaotong's face was grave and stern. His collar was neat and cold like thin leaves hanging on branches in a snowy day. It is often stupid to invest separately. Although I haven't seen the crown prince you promised to introduce me to, now I'm more and more convinced that just by investing in you, I will definitely get countless times more returns in the future. Li Xiaodong said very seriously, and Sulu also heard it very clearly. If Li Xiaodong could really win his personal friendship in the future battle for the inheritance of the Li family, those old men would have to consider the attitude of that old man in Philadelphia. Although it was certainly not decisive, it was a very important bargaining chip. "I have only met that old man once," Sulu reminded him. "It doesn't matter. At least now everyone thinks that you are related to the Lis of Philadelphia." Li Xiaotong smiled slightly, and the coldness between his eyebrows gradually disappeared. "Some people are even guessing that you are that old man's illegitimate son who has been living outside." Sulu did not spit out the red wine in his mouth. He slowly swallowed it and only felt bitter. He shook his head and sighed. "The age doesn't match. So what? The tricks that the president and the parliament are doing now are making those old men in the family very distressed." Li Xiaotong said lightly, "The current federation is no longer the old federation. Except for that madam, who dares to face the government directly. Only that tiger in the West Woods dares to scold the officials of the National Security Council at the joint conference. Why? Of course, it is because he has someone with a gun. My family has always been very envious and has been trying to establish some kind of close relationship with the military, but there has been no progress. My side seems to be progressing faster, so of course they are happy to see it happen. Sula knew that the biggest problem the Leaf family was facing now was the gold fusion algorithm proposed by President Pabre and forcibly passed by the Federation Management Committee. However, he did not know what other path the Leaf family could take to establish a close relationship with a military other than himself. At this time, Zhong Huiyin, who was brought to the room by the maid, finally put on her clothes and skipped out. The little girl came in front of Su Lu and held her chin with both hands. She blinked and said with a smile, "Brother Su Lu, do I look good?" Su Lu looked at the cute little raccoon in front of him. He did not expect Li Qixiao to find a way to make the little girl happy in such a short time. He could not help but feel admiration. The 8 lotus-like young girls had already retreated, leaving behind only 2 who were in charge of the reception. Sula looked at the young girl with delicate features and sincerely thanked her. "That's your circle. If you need me to meet them, I will come back later." Sula stood up and held Zhong Huiyin's small hand with her furry raccoon. He looked at Li Xiaotong and said with a wry smile, "My main task today is to play with her." He knew very well that the party Li Xiaotong arranged today was not necessarily an attempt to drag him into a certain circle, but it could be assumed that he also had some intention of taking advantage of the situation. After all, his origin as the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation had already become a hot topic in the upper-class society of the Federation. If he appeared, it would definitely be a bonus for Li Qixiao. Li Xiaotong indifferently spread out his right hand, indicating that he could do as he pleased. Looking at the back of Su Lu and the little girl dressed as a raccoon disappearing, he could not help but feel a little strange. Which family's child was this? Unexpectedly, Su Lu doted on her so much. Looking at the faint pride between her eyebrows and the calmness in the luxurious environment of the Wood Valley Manor, she must not be a child of an ordinary family. But he never thought of going to the Zhong family in the West Woods. In his opinion, Su Lu, a guy with a military background, was very close to the crown prince of the Tai family, and was also carefully nurtured by the old man in Philadelphia. His fate was already very good. If the little girl was the little princess of the Zhong family, Li Qixiao was afraid that he would painfully pull his hair and sigh that this kid's luck was already heaven-defying. Su Lu took the little girl to the amusement park in front of the mountain to enjoy life no longer alone. Li Wei, on the other hand, did not know why he stayed behind. The number of people in the second courtyard of the Wood Valley gradually increased. Li Xiaotong did not have the time to take care of this unknown person. After giving a few instructions to the housekeeper, he began to seriously talk with the guests. These guests were dressed very plainly, but if one were to carefully examine them, they would definitely be shocked by the handmade symbols embroidered with silk that represented money. Li Wei didn't understand these things, so he just listened quietly. With the spirit of a small fry, it only took him 10 minutes to clearly determine that the middle-aged and young people who were qualified to appear in this big house were not ordinary people. Except for a few people who were obviously as nervous as him, the rest were all big shots. Being in such an environment, Li Wei concealed his nervousness very well. While sighing, his ears perked up, especially when he heard that 2 of the fat people were big businessmen who did trade with Bermuda. The tip of his ears slightly trembled. The only one who stayed behind was the young girl, First Lotus. She was quietly and innocently listening to a topic that she would never hear in the Federation Academy of Arts. Suddenly, she was called to Li Wei's side. Li Wei lowered his voice and asked, "What's your name?" "My name is Xiaoshi." The young girl was a little nervous and cute as she answered. Li Wei whispered, "Can you give me a pen and paper?" Xiaoshi thought that this man wanted to give her contact information, and a trace of pride appeared in her delicate and charming eyes. Although this guest was dressed very plainly and not like the others who were pretending to be plain, she only knew that those who could come here were not small people. Perhaps this guest liked to play this kind of game. Thinking of this, the trace of pride between her eyebrows turned into gentleness, and she said softly, "Wait a moment." Chapter 364. Li Wei, who had been at the bottom of society since he was a child, had just been rescued by the West Woods soldiers from the Bermuda Star region. Naturally, he did not have any cards with him. As it was his first time entering the capital ring, he was still unable to adapt to the shock in his heart. However, any small character with ambition and courage would not let go of any opportunity to come into contact with a new world. He took out pieces of plain white paper and exchanged them for expensive cards made of pure plant fiber. The paper had his name and contact information written on it. The powerful figures of the various provinces did not know who this submissive and even somewhat uncomfortable young man was, but anyone who could appear at the 7th Young Masters gathering would surely have a chance to soar into the sky in the future, even if they were still unknown. Naturally, no one would reject his somewhat awkward method of exchanging information, but there would occasionally be a hint of imperceptible contempt flashing across their faces. Li Xiaodong sat on the sofa and watched this scene calmly. He knew that the contempt in the eyes of these guests was not because of Li Wei's attire, but because of his expression. After all, the only thing Li Wei could bring out was the wisdom of struggling to rise from the bottom of society. If he could really accurately judge the situation today, there was no way he would be so humble no matter what. However, even so, looking at Li Wei's submissive and humble manner, 7th Young Master Li still felt a sense of admiration for this small character. He was also 90% suspicious. This 90% suspicious was because he was very curious. What kind of place could give Su Lu and this young man, named Li Wei, the courage to clumsily but persistently break certain rules and enter certain circles? After playing crazily in the amusement park for the whole morning, Su Li's face was pale from the torment of the roller coaster ride. He held Zhong Huiyan's small hand and walked up the awe-inspiring open-air elevator at the edge of the cliff. Only when the autumn wind blew on his face did his spirit recover slightly. He did not understand why the roller coaster ride was scarier than the mecha training. Zhong Huiyan was still wearing the brown raccoon costume, but the raccoon head had long been removed. Her red face was full of sweat and her hair was wet. Her smiling eyes were still filled with excitement, happiness, and a trace of reluctance. Madame Zhong said that you have to take a nap. We'll play again in the afternoon. Su Lu held the handrail of the elevator and took out a handkerchief with his right hand to wipe the girl's sweat. He was a little worried that she would catch a cold from the mountain wind. However, on this steep cliff, the girl didn't seem to be afraid at all. Yes, Zhong Huiyan nodded heavily. Including the armed members of Team 7, there were 8 people in the elevator. They arrived at the side entrance of Wood Valley Manor halfway up the mountain and met up with Lan Xiaolong, who was guarding the elevator. Lan Xiaolong leaned close to his ear and whispered something. Su Lu was slightly startled and looked to the right. Behind an antique screen wall, 2 ancient pines poked their heads out. There was a group of people standing on the cliff in front of the screen wall, pointing out the mountains and rivers. There was an indescribable heroic spirit that reached the clouds. However, looking at the 2 proud faces in the middle of the group, Su Lu only felt that the clouds and mist in this beautiful mountain valley had dispersed too quickly. How could he see them again and let them sully this mountain scenery? Li Qixiao said that they wouldn't disturb him, but there was an old Federation proverb that said that if they weren't true enemies, they wouldn't always be together because of fate. This seemed to be referring to this scene. Su Lu was afraid of trouble, but he also didn't want to cause trouble, let alone these 2 boring people. He glanced at the second son of Nanshui's leader, Nan Mingxiu, and the heir of the Lin family, Lin Do-hai, and shook his head. He then held Zhong Huiyan's hand and stepped onto the stone path, preparing to leave. However, in the end, he underestimated the high degree of summation and magical power of the Federation proverb. The group of youths who were pointing out the mountains and rivers and pretending to have the aura of nobility just happened to rest at this moment. They were preparing to enjoy the most famous feast in Wood Valley. As soon as they turned around, they saw them. The 2 groups of people were stunned at the same time. No one said anything. The silence lasted for 3 seconds. Suddenly, Lin Do-hai smiled and said, "What a coincidence. I didn't think that a small place like my family could actually invite such a big figure like you. Lin Dohai's original intention was to mock Su Lu, but now that the men of the seventh group are following Su Lu closely, it really did make Su Lu seem like a big figure. Many of the youths in the group revealed doubtful expressions. A few of the youths who had been fortunate enough to attend the charity banquet that night and watch the confrontation on the terrace revealed vigilant expressions. These days, Nan Mingxiu had been well received by the young masters of the Federation. He enjoyed the good old wine and knew delicious people that he could not enjoy in Green Dragon Mountain. He felt that his life was so happy. His father should have reconciled with the Federation long ago. Today, in the Wood Valley Manor, he had been well received by Lin Dohai. Just as he was in high spirits, he saw the person he hated the most. Nan Mingxiu was now clear about Su Li's background. However, how could an idiot develop into a proud idiot? Naturally, it was because he believed that his background was greater and was used as speaking with his background and fists. The Federation strictly controlled firearms, but gave the Green Dragon Mountain delegation great privileges, allowing them to bring a group of independent military forces into the capital. The Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain knew that the government's arrangement was to express goodwill, so they did not bring many people from S2. There were only 30 or so people who were responsible for the daily protection of the delegation. And it was this group of brave and skilled anti-government soldiers that ended up being taken away by Nan Mingxiu, the leader's son. At this time, these 10 soldiers all stood behind him. On the balcony of the reception party, Su Lu understood the principle of light wind and cloud from the barrel of a gun. Nan Mingxiu, the leader's son, undoubtedly also understood this point. So today, he was even more insufferably arrogant than before. The gloomy anger on his face was not concealed at all. He walked directly in front of Su Lu and the others and coldly said, "Last time at the reception, you warned me once. Today, I want to return that warning to you." Su Lu looked at the leader's son in front of him. He wondered if the people from Green Dragon Mountain all had some mental problems. Zhang Xiaoming was such a good girl, yet she was forcibly harmed to such an extent. However, Mr. Shi's group of professional spies did not seem to be so stupid. Oh, right. That was because Mr. Zhong Kai's deep sea was not in Green Dragon Mountain at all. Since you and Comrade Zhang Xiaoming have nothing to do with each other anymore, I think you should not interfere with the matters between me and her in the future. Nan Mingxiu's face was gloomy. He thought he was very tolerant and gracious when he said this. Then, he lowered his voice and said to Su Lu, "No matter how strong your background is, what right do you have to interfere with our internal affairs? The matters between Zhang Xiaoming and I are not for you to interfere. After all, you are just an ex-boyfriend. Don't worry. When I get her, I will report to you." Nan Mingxiu made a mistake. He only found out about the relationship between Su Lu and the Lees of Philadelphia. He did not know about the violent deeds of Su Lu that made the entire upper class of the Federation fall into a dilemma. He also did not know that Su Lu was not best at verbal attacks, but was best at fists. 2 years ago, at the Double Moon Festival Ball, Counselor Sun Sun had said something similar. It seemed that whether it was the privileged class of the Federation or the privileged class of the anti-government army, they were very similar in this aspect. They knew how to make a man angry, but they forgot what the price of anger was. Counselor Sun Sun paid with a few broken teeth and a face full of blood. What about this leader's son? Su Lu still quietly narrowed his eyes and looked at him. The story on the balcony of the reception party had already spread in the Federation. The men of Group 7 knew very well about the very complicated emotional entanglement between their manager and Green Dragon Mountain's Yi. Lan Xiaolong shrugged behind him, shook his head, and said faintly, "Brother, I am not a person who likes to stir up trouble, but if you can still tolerate this matter, I really can't stand it." As his voice fell, under the ancient pine trees halfway up the cliff, a gust of wind blew in front of the screen wall. Su Lu raised his hand, grabbed Nan Mingxiu's throat, and directly pushed him against the screen wall, making a muffled sound. The anti-government army's special guards, who had been vigilantly protecting Nanmingxiu, immediately took out their guns nervously and aimed at Su Li's back. However, immediately afterwards, a shadow blocked the muzzle of their guns. Apart from Xiong Linquan, who had a special gun permit and could carry guns at all times, the men of Group 7 all had their guns in the military vehicles and could not carry them with them. However, even so, they still had cold expressions, fearlessly blocking Su Li's back. In front of the muzzle of their guns, it was as if they did not care at all, even if the muzzle of these soldiers' guns sprayed out. "Put down your guns." Lin Dohai saw this scene, and a chill rushed to his brain. He shouted loudly while blocking in front of those Green Dragon Mountain soldiers without any regard for his precious body. Those soldiers knew that this person was on good terms with the leader's son, so they subconsciously lowered the muzzle of their guns. Lin Dohai let out a sigh of relief. Although he hated Su Lu very much, he knew that if these soldiers were allowed to shoot Su Lu or Su Li's security personnel to death, or even injure them, if that old man from Philadelphia was angry, who in the Federation could withstand the old man's anger? Su Lu did not care about the muzzle of the guns behind him. This was the Lin family's territory. Even if Lin Dohai was extremely stupid, he would not let these anti-government soldiers open fire. Furthermore, Nanmingxiu's throat was in his hands. These loyal and stupid anti-government soldiers would not dare to act rashly. He stared at Nanmingxiu's flushed face, his eyes gradually showing fear, and said in a low voice, "You are right. Zhang Xiaoming is not my woman now. However, no matter who wants to be her man, I have to give the nod." Many people on the cliff heard this sentence and could not help but change their expressions. They thought that this young master was too *king unreasonable. Even Lan Xiaolong, who claimed that he did not like to stir up trouble, but was actually stirring up trouble everywhere, could not help but be shocked speechless by this tyrannical and unreasonable sentence. Cool. After hearing Su Li's announcement, Zhong Yanhua, who was hugging the cute raccoon head, opened her eyes wide and exclaimed softly, "You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."